Hey guys, tonight we are heading back in time to the American Wild West. But we're not going to the Hollywood version with the heroic gunslingers and the noble quests. No, we're going to the real one. The gritty, muddy, and profoundly uncomfortable version where, let's be honest, you would probably get a nasty disease before you even saw a cowboy. It's a story about survival, but not in the way you might think. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It helps me know what kind of journeys you want to go on. And while you're in, drop me a comment and let me know what city you're in and what time it is for you right now. It's always amazing to see where everyone is listening from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. It all starts with an idea. A brilliant, shimmering, and utterly terrible idea. Right now, you're not in the West. You're somewhere in the East. Or maybe even across the ocean in a crowded European city. Your world is small and smells of coal smoke and damp wool. Life is a predictable rhythm of hard work for little pay. You wake up before the sun. You work a job that grinds down your body and soul. And you come home to a cramped room you share with too many people. The future looks a lot like the present, just older. Then, one day, you see it. It might be a poster pasted on a brick wall. Its colors a startling splash against the city-esque grime. It might be a pamphlet someone hands you, the paper glossy and new. Or maybe it's a letter from a cousin's friend who went west a few years ago. The words glowing with an almost unbelievable optimism. The message is always the same. Go west. The poster shows a family standing before a quaint, sturdy-looking log cabin. The father is tall and proud, the mother serene, and the children are holding vegetables that seem impossibly large. A pumpkin the size of a wagon wheel, ears of corn as tall as a man. The sky behind them is a perfect, cloudless blue, and a river, clear as glass, meanders through a field of golden wheat. The land, it promises, is practically free. The government, in its infinite wisdom, has passed something called the Homestead Act. 160 acres. The words themselves sound like a kingdom. All you have to do is go there, build a home, and farm the land for 5 years. Then it's yours. All yours. This, right here, is the first and most powerful myth of the West. The mainstream historical knowledge is that the Homestead Act of 1860 populated the frontier. And it did. On paper. But what you're holding in your hand isn't really a government document. It's an advertisement. The real engine behind this dream-peddling wasn't just Uncle Sam. It was the railroads. This is one of those little details that gets lost in the epic cowboy tales. The railroad companies were given vast tracts of land by the government as an incentive to lay track. But empty land alongside a railroad is worthless. They needed people. They needed you. So they launched one of the most effective marketing campaigns in history. They printed millions of pamphlets in multiple languages and sent agents all over the Eastern U. Yes, and Europe. They sold the West like a miracle cure. They called it the Garden of the World. They promised rain would follow the plow. A tragically incorrect theory that suggested cultivating the land would magically change the climate to be more favorable. They conveniently left out the parts about the swarms of locusts that could eat a year's crop in a day, the brutal winters that could freeze a person solid in minutes, or the fact that much of that free 160 acres was arid. Treeless prairie where digging a well was a back-breaking gamble. You read the words and you let yourself believe. You're tired of the factory whistle, of the landlord's knock, of the feeling that your life is a story already written by someone else. The West is a blank page. Your page. The idea takes root in your mind. A tiny seed of hope in the barren soil of your daily life. You start talking about it in hushed tones with your spouse or a trusted friend. What if? You whisper. What if we could have a farm of our own? A place where our children could run free. Historians still debate the primary driver of this massive migration. Was it purely economic desperation? A push from the miserable conditions of the industrial East and the overfarmed lands of Europe? Or was it the powerful pull of the American myth itself, the ideology of manifest destiny, the belief in a God-given right to expand, and the romantic notion of the rugged individual taming the wilderness? For you, sitting in your dim little room, it's not an academic question. It's a potent cocktail of both. You are being pushed by the life you haven't, pulled by the life you've been promised. You look at the faces of your family. You think of the endless, grinding sameness of your days. And then you look back at that colorful poster, at that family with the giant pumpkin. The decision crystallizes, not in a moment of grand, heroic clarity, but in a quiet, desperate resolve. You're going to do it. You're going to sell what little you have, pack up your life, and chase that horizon. It's the best, most hopeful, and most dangerous decision you will ever make. You just don't know it yet. The decision has been made. A strange mix of terror and exhilaration now hums beneath your skin. You feel like an adventurer, an explorer, a pioneer. In reality, you're about to become a logistics manager for a very poorly planned, high-stakes expedition. The first task, packing. This is where you will make your second mistake. A mistake that could prove just as fatal as underestimating the weather or drinking from the wrong stream. You stand in your small home, surrounded by the accumulated objects of your life. Every item represents a memory, a comfort, a piece of your identity, and you have to decide what fits into a single, rickety wooden wagon. The wagon itself is a major purchase, likely a Conestoga or a more common and smaller prairie scooter. It's basically a wooden box on wheels, about 10 feet long and 4 feet wide. This tiny space is now your moving van, your pantry, and your bedroom for the better part of the next year. Your mind, still clouded by the romantic visions of the pamphlets, leads you astray. You look at your grandmother's rocking chair. You can just picture it sitting on the porch of your future log cabin. Can't you? It has to come. And the family china. Of course. You'll need it for the celebratory dinners you'll host in your new Western home. What about the heavy oak dresser? The one that took for people to get up the stairs. It's a piece of real quality, a symbol of civilization. It seems essential. Maybe you even have a small pump organ or a piano. The very soul of culture. How could you leave it behind? You imagine your family gathered around it on a Sunday evening, singing hymns as the sun sets over your vast fields of wheat. It's a beautiful picture. It's also a deadly one. This is a well-documented and heartbreaking part of the westward journey. The trails heading west were literally littered with the discarded dreams of the pioneers. Heavy furniture, heirlooms, even pianos, were abandoned alongside the path as the reality of the journey set in. Every extra pound of weight was a strain on the oxen or mules that pulled your wagon. Tired animals meant a slower pace. A slower pace meant you might not make it over the mountains before the first snow. And that was a death sentence. The smart thing to do, the thing that seasoned traders and mountain men knew, was to pack for function, not for feeling. The most valuable items you could carry were not symbols of your old life, but the tools for your new one. You needed an axe, a shovel, an auger for digging wells, ropes, and chains for pulling the wagon out of the inevitable mud. You needed tools for repairing the wagon, because it would break. But your mind isn't there yet. You're still packing for the life you imagine, not the one you are about to live. Now for the food. The pamphlets suggested you could hunt and forage along the way. And you could, to an extent. But relying on that was a fool's game. You needed to pack enough food to survive for at least 6 months. The standard provision list for one adult was a start. Monotonous collection of calories. You'd need about 150 pounds of flour, 20 pounds of cornmeal, and maybe 50 pounds of bacon. Yes, bacon. It was the meat of choice because it was cured and packed in its own grease, making it last longer. You'd also pack pounds of coffee, sugar, salt, and baking soda. That's it. That's your diet. But here's a weird little detail that often gets overlooked. One of the most sought after and practical items to pack was a keg of pickles. Why pickles? Because they were a source of vinegar. In a world without modern medicine, vinegar was a multi-purpose miracle substance. It could be used to clean wounds, settle an upset stomach, and, most importantly, it helped combat scurvy, the lack of vitamin C on that blend. Starchy diet was a real threat, and while you might not have known the science behind it, you'd have heard stories about the horrors of scurvy. Your gums bleeding, your teeth falling out, old wounds reopening. So, a keg of sour pickles was far more valuable than a set of fine china. Historians are still piecing together the exact economic calculus of this journey. For many, the cost of outfitting a wagon, buying the animals, the wagon itself, and 6 months of supplies was more than a year's wages. Many families went into deep debt before they even started, selling everything they owned and taking loans just for a chance at that free land. The idea that the West was a safety valve for the poor is a complex one. Was it truly an option for the most destitute? Or was it primarily an opportunity for those who already had a small amount of capital to risk? The evidence suggests that the poorest of the poor often couldn't even afford the starting line. So you pack. You make your choices. You load the heavy dresser in the rocking chair. You pack less flour and bacon to make room. You might even decide to bring only 1 water barrel instead of 2 to save on weight. You look at your overloaded wagon, a precarious Jenga tower of hope and bad decisions. Your animals, usually a team of 4 to 6 oxen, stand patiently. They are the true heroes of this story, stoic and powerful. They were preferred over horses because they were slower but steadier, less likely to be stolen, and could survive on the prairie grasses. They were also, in a grim final resort, edible. You don't think about that now? You take one last look at the home you're leaving. You say your goodbyes. The wagon groans under the weight of your dreams as you pull out onto the road. You're finally on your way, and you're already in trouble. The first few days are a novelty. The rhythmic clop of the oxen's hooves, the gentle squeak of the wagon wheels, the feeling of the open road. It's almost like the adventure you were promised. You and your family might even try riding in the wagon, thinking it a charming way to travel. You learn within hours that this is a terrible idea. The wagon has no suspension. Every single rut, and bump in the road is transferred directly into your bones. It's a nauseating, jarring, and thoroughly miserable experience. So you get out and what? And you will what? And what? And what? You are now on the Oregon Trail. Or perhaps the California or Mormon Trail. They are less like roads and more like suggestions. A wide, braided scar of countless ruts and hoof prints stretching across the continent for over 2 miles. Your destination is a hazy dream. Months away. Your reality is the 10 or 15 miles you hope to cover today. This is essential. grinding truth of the overland journey that Hollywood films compress into a 30-second montage. It was not a grand cavalcade. It was a slow, grueling, pedestrian experience. The vast majority of pioneers walked almost the entire way. The dust is the first thing that gets to you. It's not just normal dust. It's a fine, powdery substance, kicked up by thousands of hooves and wheels ahead of you in the wagon train. It coats everything you own. It gets into your food, your water, your lungs. You can feel it gritting between your teeth when you chew your dinner. At the end of the day, you are covered in a layer of grime, a mask of the very earth you're trying to cross. You try to wash it off with your carefully rationed water, but you can never get truly clean. The routine becomes a hypnotic, soul-crushing loop. You wake before sunrise. The air is cold. The ground is hard. You coax a small fire to life using buffalo chips, dried dung, because there are no trees for miles. This is a small but significant shot. You'd never imagined that you'd be cooking your breakfast over burning manure. The smell is pungent. You brew coffee, fry up some bacon, and choke down a piece of hard bread. Then you yoke the oxen, which is a difficult and often dangerous task. The animals are tired and cranky, just like you. By the time the sun is fully up, you're on the move, 10 to 15 miles a day. That's a walking pace of about 2 miles per hour. You walk beside the lumbering wagon, your eyes scanning the ground ahead for obstacles. The sun beats down on you. There is no shade. You wear a wide-brimmed hat, but the heat is relentless. Your lips crack. Your skin burns. The landscape is immense and unchanging. For weeks, all you see is a flat, endless ocean of prairie grass under a vast, empty sky. The sheer scale of it is hard to comprehend. It's beautiful in a terrifying sort of way. It makes you feel incredibly small and insignificant. This is where the psychological toll begins. The monotony is a kind of torture. The same view, the same food, the same plodding pace, day after day. Tempers flare. Your family, once a source of comfort, is now a collection of irritable, exhausted people crammed into a shared ordeal. Arguments break out over trivial things. Whose turn it is to fetch the water, how much sugar to use. A misplaced tool. Here's a small, sad detail of trail life. The loss of things. Not just the big furniture you might have to abandon later. Small things. A child's favorite doll falls from the wagon and is lost in the dust. A tin cup. Your only cup. Rattles loose and is gone forever. These tiny losses feel monumental out here. They are a constant reminder of your slow disintegration, of how the trail is stripping you of your former life. Piece by piece. The mainstream idea is that wagon trains were tight-knit communities, a rolling town of mutual support. This was true, to an extent. People had to cooperate to survive. But these were not communities of friends. They were business arrangements, formed out of necessity, and they were often rife with conflict. Historians who study pioneer diaries have found that arguments over leadership, trail discipline, and the speed of travel were constant. Some wagon trains split apart in anger, with factions going their separate ways. The question of who was in charge was always a point of contention. Should it be the person with the most experience, the one who owned the most wagons, the one with the loudest voice? The debate over governance and authority, a classic American theme, was playing out in miniature on the dusty plains. Who gets to make the rules when there is no government? It's a question that continues to be debated in political philosophy today. By evening, you are bone tired. You circle the wagons, not so much for protection against attack, a threat that was statistically very rare, despite what the movies show. But to create a corral for the animals, you unyoke the exhausted oxen, lead them to graze and water. You start another dung fire. You cook another meal of bacon and bread. You might try to mend a torn shirt or repair a wheel spoke by the flickering firelight. You force yourself to check your supplies, your heart sinking a little as you see how much flour is gone. Then you crawl under the wagon or into a small tent. The ground is still your bed. You lie there, listening to the sounds of the prairie, the wind whistling through the grass, the distant yip of a coyote, the lowing of the oxen. You ache in places you didn't know you could ache. You close your eyes, not with a sense of peace, but with a feeling of dread for the fact that tomorrow you have to get up and do it all over again. The adventure is gone. This is just work. Hard, endless, dusty work. The sun has become your tormentor. Every morning it rises, promising another day of relentless heat and thirst. Your lips are permanently chapped, and the water in your barrel is warm and tastes of stale wood. You are learning a fundamental lesson of the West, one that defines life here more than any gunfight. The search for water is everything. It is the real gold rush. You're in a stretch of country now where the landscape has begun to change. The gentle green prairies are giving way to something harder, drier, and more unforgiving. The grass is sparse and yellowed. The earth is baked and cracked. The rivers on your map, drawn with such confident blue lines, turn out to be deceptive. Many are just dry, sandy beds. Others are sluggish, muddy trickles, barely moving. Your wagon train has a guide, or at least someone who claims to be one. He has a tattered map and a lot of confidence. But you're beginning to realize he is often just as lost as you are. His knowledge is based on landmarks that can shift and change. A certain oddly shaped trunk, a lone tree, a bend in a river. These are the signposts for survival. But what if the rock is crumbled? What if the tree was struck by lightning? Your daily life now revolves around the water barrel. You ration it with an iron fist. A cup for cooking, a sip for each person. No washing. You watch the water level drop with a knot of anxiety in your stomach. The oxen need water most of all. Without it, they will collapse, and your journey will end, stranding you in the middle of nowhere. Their heaving, thirsty panting is a constant, dreadful soundtrack to your days. Finding a good water source is a moment of pure, unadulterated joy. You see it from a distance, a line of green trees in the distance, a dip in the terrain. Hope surges. You quicken your pace, your exhaustion temporarily forgotten. But getting to the water is only half the battle. Now, you have to decide if it's safe to drink. This is a life or death gamble. Some springs and pools are crystal clear, but are actually alkaline, loaded with dissolved salts that can make you violently ill, or even kill you. These are poison pools. The pioneers had a crude but effective test. Watch the animals. If there are no animal tracks leading to the water's edge, or worse, if there are animal skeletons nearby, you stay away. It's a chilling sight, a beautiful, tempting oasis of clear water surrounded by the bones of those who fell for its trap. Even if the water isn't alkaline, it's likely contaminated. The wagon rains ahead of you, and their hundreds of animals have used the same water sources. They've camped by the rivers, washed in them, and left their waste behind. The water you're about to scoop into your cup is very likely teeming with bacteria that your body has never encountered. This is how cholera, the Blue Death, spreads like wildfire along the trail. You don't know about germs. Of course, the concept is decades away from being understood. You just know that sometimes, after drinking from a river, people start to get sick. Horribly sick. Here's a bizarre and disgusting little tidbit about trail hygiene. What did you do when you came across a water source that was thick with mud wigglers mosquito larvae? You couldn't afford to be picky. One common trick was to stir a bit of cornmeal into the bucket of water. As the cornmeal settled to the bottom, it would drag some of the silt and other particulates down with it, making the water on top slightly clearer. It didn't purify the water, not even a little bit, but it made it psychologically easier to swallow. You drank the clarified water and tried not to think about what was still swimming in it. The historical record is full of accounts of suffering from thirst. People wrote in their diaries about their tongues swelling in their mouths, about the hallucinations, about the desperate measures they took. They would dig in dry riverbeds, hoping to find a seep of moisture deep in the sand. They would lick the morning dew off the canvas of the wagon cover. The search for water was so central that it spawned its own folklore in the body of practical, if sometimes flawed, knowledge. Historians are still debating the accuracy of many of the so-called guidebooks that were popular at the time. Books like Lansford Hastings, The Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California were bestsellers. They promised detailed maps and reliable information. But were these authors seasoned experts? Or were they just entrepreneurs cashing in on the westward craze? The case of Lansford Hastings is particularly infamous. His guide promoted a new, unproven shortcut that led the ill-fated Donner Party into a trap in the Sierra Nevada mountains. The line between helpful advice and deadly misinformation was perilously thin. And for you, on the ground, it was impossible to know what you were getting. Your life depended on a map that might have been drawn by a charlatan. Tonight, you are lucky. You found a decent stream. The water is running, and while it's not exactly clear, it doesn't have the telltale shimmer of alkali. You let the oxen drink their fill first, watching them with a profound sense of relief. Then you fill your barrels, the sound of the sloshing water more precious than music. You drink deeply yourself, ignoring the earthy taste. You even allow yourself the luxury of splashing some on your face, washing away the layers of dust. For a brief moment, the anxiety recedes. You have water. You have survived another day. You try not to think about how far you have to go until the next reliable source, the one marked on your tattered, perhaps treacherous, map. You've been on the trail for weeks now, and you've fallen into the grim rhythm of the march. You've learned to endure the dust, the heat, and the monotony. You think you're getting the hang of this. Then you come to a river. It's not a gentle, meandering stream you can easily ford. This is the North Platte, or the Kansas River. A wide, deep, and powerful current of muddy water, barring your path like a gatekeeper. Your heart sinks. A river crossing is one of the most dangerous and feared events of the entire journey. In fact, despite the Hollywood obsession with shootouts and ambushes, historical records are clear. More pioneers died from drowning during river crossings than from violent conflict. The river was a far deadlier foe than any bandit. You stand on the bank with the rest of the wagon ring, a congregation of anxious souls staring at the churning brown water. The sound of it is a lull, or a reminder of its raw power. There are no bridges. There might be a ferry, if you're lucky enough to be at a major crossing point. But the ferry is often just a couple of rickety flat boats lashed together, operated by enterprising individuals who charge an exorbitant fee. The price could be several dollars per wagon, a huge sum for you. Then you'd watch with your heart in your throat as your entire worldly existence teetered on that flimsy raft. The ferrymen were notorious for price gouging, knowing you had no other choice. If there's no ferry, you're on your own. Now, a debate breaks out. Another classic scene of wagon train democracy. How should you cross? One method is to caulk the wagon bed. You and your fellow travelers would spend a day or more stuffing tarn cloth into every crack and seam of your wooden wagon box, trying to make it watertight. Then you detach the wheels and try to float the box across like a crude boat, with the panicking oxen swimming alongside, guided by men on horseback. This was incredibly risky. If you missed a single crack, the wagon would swamp, filling with water and sinking in moments, taking all your precious supplies, your flour, your sugar, your tools, to the bottom of the river. Another option is to raise the wagon bed. You'd use wooden blocks to lift the entire box higher on its chassis, hoping the water isn't deeper than your axles. Then you de-chain multiple teams of oxen together, sometimes 10 or 12, to give them enough combined strength to pull the heavy, submerged wagon against the current without being swept away. You watch as the first family attempts the crossing. The men shout. The whips crack. The lead oxen plunge into the cold water, their eyes wide with fear. The wagon lurches forward and slams into the river. The water is higher than expected. It swirls up around the wagon bed, threatening to flood it. The current is strong, pushing the wagon sideways, downstream. For a terrifying moment, it looks like it's going to tip. A woman on the bank screams, but the oxen pull hard, their hooves finding purchase on the slick, rocky riverbed, and slowly, agonizingly, they drag the wagon up the opposite bank. A collective sigh of relief ripples through the crowd. One wagon is across. Now it's your turn. This is where you might encounter a strange and fascinating bit of frontier ingenuity. The bow boat. If a river was too deep to ford and you had no good way to float your wagon, you might have to build one of these. What is it? Well, it's a temporary boat made from materials you had on hand. You'd create a round, bowl-shaped frame out of flexible willow branches, and then stretch greased buffalo hides over it. It was essentially a skin-covered basket. They were hideously unstable and ugly, but they were buoyant. You'd have to unload your entire wagon, ferry your goods across in multiple trips in this wobbly, leaky little craft, and then reassemble everything on the other side. It was an exhausting, all-day affair, and you had to hope your buffalo hides didn't have any holes. The chaos of a river crossing was immense. The water was a slurry of mud, animal waste, and shouting people. Wagons got stuck. Wheels broke on submerged rocks. Oxen, panicked by the cold and the current, could get tangled in their harnesses and drown. And sometimes, people slipped. A child playing too close to the edge. A man waiting to guide an ox. A woman trying to secure a loose item on the wagon. They could be swept away in an instant. The river was merciless. There was no time for funerals. You simply had to keep moving. The debate among historians here is a subtle one, concerning the social dynamics of these moments. Did they share crises, like a river crossing, forge stronger community bonds through mutual aid, or did they exacerbate tensions? As people's differing appetites for risk and blame for any failures came to the forefront, the diaries from the trail suggest both are true. You see incredible acts of heroism, where strangers risk their lives to help a family in trouble. You also read bitter accounts of people being accused of cowardice, of arguments over whose turn it was to go first, and of families being abandoned by the group after a tragic accident because they were slowing everyone down. Your turn comes. You urge your oxen forward, your voice tight with fear. The wagon plunges into the water. It's colder than you imagine. The current grabs your wheels, and you feel the immense, impersonal force of the river trying to take control. You are shouting, Your family is shouting. Everyone is shouting. The wagon lurches and groans. You can hear water sloshing against the bottom of the bed. And you pray your caulking holds. For a few long, heart-stopping minutes. Your entire future hangs in the balance, dependent on the strength of a few wooden planks and the stamina of your terrified animals. Then, with a final, shuddering pull, you feel the wheels bite into the soft mud of the far bank. You've made it. You are soaked, shivering, and emotionally drained. But you are across. You don't even have time to feel relief, because now you have to help the next person. The day is far from over. You've crossed the rivers. You've survived the endless plains. Now, looming in the distance, is the next great obstacle. The mountains. The Rockies. They are a jagged wall of stone and forest, a breathtaking and terrifying sight. For weeks, they have been a faint silhouette on the horizon, but now you are in their foothills, and their true scale is becoming apparent. The air is thinner here, and a chill creeps in, even during the day. Your shortcut-loving guide, or perhaps the collective wisdom of the wagon train, has made a critical calculation. It's late in the season, maybe August, or even early September. You have a window, a slim, unforgiving window of time to get through the high mountain passes before the first heavy snows arrive. Everyone knows the stories. Everyone has heard whispers of the Donner Party. The name itself has become a cautionary tale, a grim legend told around the campfires. They were wrapped by an early winter, and descended into horrors you don't want to even imagine. The pressure is on. The leisurely 2-mile-per-hour pace is no longer acceptable. The journey becomes a race. You push yourself, your family, and your animals to the breaking point. You travel longer hours, starting before dawn and continuing until dusk. The terrain is brutal. The gentle, rolling trail is gone, replaced by steep, narrow paths littered with rocks. You are constantly either climbing or descending. Going up is a slow, grueling torture. You have to double-team the wagons, combining the oxen from 2 or 3 families to pull a single wagon up a steep incline. You walk beside the wagon, pushing with all your might, your lungs burning in the thin air, your muscles screaming in protest. Sometimes the slope is so steep you have to unload the wagon completely, carrying your precious sacks of flour and barrels of water up the hill by hand. Piece by agonizing piece. Descending is, if anything, even more dangerous. A fully loaded wagon going downhill is a runaway death machine. The oxen can't hold it back. You have to lock the wheels, making them drag and skid rather than roll. On the steepest slopes, you cut down a tree and tie it to the back of the wagon to act as a brake. A huge, scraping anchor digging into the trail. You might even tie ropes to the back and have a dozen people hang on, trying to manually slow its descent. A snapped chain, a broken rope, and your wagon, your entire life, would splinter into 1,000 pieces at the bottom of a ravine. This is the point in the journey where you finally have to abandon those heirlooms you so foolishly packed. The trail through the mountains is littered with the evidence of this harsh reality. You pass a beautifully carved rocking chair. It would bleach by the sun. A little further on, an oak dresser lies on its side, its drawers pulled out and empty. And then you see it. A piano. A whole, full-sized piano, sitting absurdly in the middle of the wilderness. A monument to a shattered dream. Now you understand. The weight is too much. The dream is too heavy. With a heavy heart, you unburden your own wagon, leaving behind a piece of your past on the side of the trail for someone else to stare at in wonder. Here's a small, weird detail about mountain travel. Altitude sickness. You wouldn't have a name for it, but you would feel its effects. You'd call it mountain fever. You, your family, and your animals would get splitting headaches, feel nauseous and dizzy, and be utterly exhausted from the simplest tasks. You would attribute it to bad air or exhaustion, not realizing it was a physiological reaction to the lack of oxygen. It was just another mysterious ailment sent to test your endurance. And then, one afternoon, the sky changes. The crisp blue darkens to a bruised, heavy gray. The wind picks up, carrying a biting cold that feels different, more menacing. A few snowflakes begin to drift down. At first, they are almost beautiful, a gentle novelty, but they don't stop. They get thicker, heavier, swirling in the wind. Within an hour, you are in a full-blown blizzard. Panic sets in. The trail vanishes. You can't see the wagon 10 feet in front of you. The wind howls, a physical force that pushes against you and chills you to the bone. This is it. This is the nightmare scenario. You are being caught by an early winter. You try to find shelter. A grove of trees, the lee of a cliff, anything to break the wind. You draw the wagons into a tight circle. The snow piles up with terrifying speed, burying the grass your oxen need to eat. It drifts up against the wagons, sealing you in. The world shrinks to the tiny, freezing space of your canvas-covered wagon. The historical debate here revolves around the decision-making of these trapped groups. When faced with a situation like this, what was the right call? Should you hunker down and try to wait out the storm, conserving your energy and supplies? Or should you make a desperate push to get over the pass, risking getting lost or freezing in the open? The tragic story of the Donner Party is a case study in this. They chose to hunker down, building crude shelters, but their supplies ran out. Other, less famous groups faced similar dilemmas. Some who pushed on perished in the storm. Some who waited were rescued. Some who waited starved. There was no single right answer, just a terrifying gamble. The psychology of a group of desperate people trying to make a life-or-death choice is something historians and sociologists still study. You huddle inside your wagon with your family, wrapped in every blanket and piece of clothing you own. The cold is a physical presence, seeping through the canvas, through the wood, into your very bones. You melt snow for water, but your food supply, already low after months on the trail, is now critically finite. You count your biscuits. You measure your flour. A day passes, then another. The snow keeps falling. The silence outside is absolute, a heavy, white blanket of death. The hope that has carried you for thousands of miles begins to curdle into a cold, hard knot of fear. You look at the faces of your loved ones. Their skin blue with cold, their eyes wide with the same terror you feel. You are trapped. The garden of the world has become a frozen hell, and you don't know if you'll ever see the sun again. Somehow, you survived the mountains. Maybe the storm broke. Maybe you found the pass just in time. Maybe you were just lucky. The memory of the snow and the paralyzing fear is a cold stone in your gut. But you pushed through. Now, you've descended into the promised land. You've made it. You've arrived in the West. But it looks nothing like the poster. You roll your battered wagon into what passes for a town. It might be a mining boomtown in California or Colorado, or a fledgling settlement on the plains of Kansas. It doesn't have a name yet. Or if it does, it's something crude and temporary like Muddy Gulch or Dust Devil's Rest. And it lives up to the name. There are no neat log cabins with white picket fences. There are no clean, wide streets. The first thing that hits you is the mud. If it's the wet season, the streets are a sea of thick, viscous, ankle-deep mud. It's a mixture of dirt, rainwater, animal waste, and garbage. The entire town is a stinking quagmire. People have laid down loose planks of wood to serve as sidewalks, but they wobble and sink, and a misstep can plunge you into the cold, foul-smelling ooze. More than one story from the period tells of a mule or even a person getting hopelessly stuck and needing to be pulled out. The mud is not just an inconvenience. It's a dominant feature of the landscape, a symbol of the town's chaotic, unfinished nature. If it's the dry season, it's dust, the same fight. Choking powder from the trail is now your permanent environment. It's whipped into blinding clouds by the relentless wind, coating everything in a gritty film. Either way, the town is an assault on your senses. The buildings are a hasty, thrown-together collection of canvas tents, rough-sawn timber shacks, and the occasional sod house. Nothing is painted. Nothing is permanent. Everything looks like it was erected last week and might fall down next week. The sounds are a cacophony of hammers banging, saws whining, men shouting in a dozen different languages, the braying of mules, and the constant, tinny plink of a piano from one of the canvas-walled saloons. This isn't a community. It's a camp. Rural, chaotic, and desperately optimistic construction site. You find a place to park your wagon on the edge of this sprawling mess. And that wagon, which felt so cramped and miserable on the trail, now seems like a sanctuary of familiar order amidst the chaos. You have arrived, but you have nowhere to live. You have no job. Your carefully hoarded supplies are almost gone. The dream of your 160-acre farm seems impossibly distant. First, you have to survive the town. This is where the social fabric of the West, or lack thereof, becomes starkly apparent. The population is overwhelmingly young and male. They are miners, prospectors, railroad workers, teamsters, and drifters, all drawn by the promise of quick wealth. It's a society stripped of its traditional structures. No established churches, no town councils, few families, and even fewer grandmothers. The atmosphere is one of restless, aggressive energy. Fights are common, fueled by cheap whiskey and dashed hopes. Here's a small, telling detail about these boomtowns. The architecture of the saloons. The iconic swinging doors were just for dramatic entrances. They served a practical purpose. They allowed for ventilation in a crowded, smoky room, provided a bit of privacy for the patrons inside, and, crucially, allowed a man who had been thrown out to exit quickly and dramatically without having to fumble with the doorknob. They were a design feature born of function and frequent, low-grade violence. The mainstream historical narrative often focuses on the lawlessness of these towns, the gunfighters and the sheriffs. But the far more common story was one of economic desperation and exploitation. Everything is wildly expensive. The shopkeepers, who got here before you did, have a monopoly. A shovel that cost $1 back east costs $10 here. A sack of flour is a small fortune. Your money, which seemed like so much when you started, evaporates in a matter of days. You've traded one form of economic hardship for another, more acute one. The question of what, exactly, constituted a town in the West is something historians still puzzle over. When does a temporary camp become a permanent settlement? Some scholars argue it was the arrival of a significant number of women and families, which brought pressure for schools, churches, and a more stable social order. Others point to the establishment of formal legal structures, like a courthouse or an office. Still others argue it was the construction of more permanent buildings, the replacement of canvas and rough wood with brick and stone. For you, these academic distinctions mean nothing. You're standing in the mud, your children huddled by the wagon, looking at this chaotic, intimidating mess. This is the garden of the world you sacrificed everything for. The beautiful lie of the poster has been stripped away, revealing a harsh, ugly, and profoundly disappointing truth. The journey over the plains and mountains was a battle against nature. This, you realize, is a battle against disillusionment. You have to find a way to build a life, a home, a future, starting with nothing but a tired body and a wagon full of dusty memories, in a place that feels like the edge of the world. The real work, the work of putting down roots in this unforgiving soil, is just beginning. The dream of a proper log cabin, the one from the recruitment posters with the smoke curling cozily from a stone chimney, dies quickly. You are on the Great Plains, Kansas, Nebraska, Dakotas. You look around and you see the problem. Or rather, you see the lack of a problem. There are no trees. Not for miles, not for hundreds of miles. The vast, treeless prairie that was so alien and intimidating on your journey is now your home. And it lacks the one resource you assumed was universal: wood. So, how do you build a house without wood? You build it out of the only thing you have in abundance, the ground itself. You are going to build a soddy, a house made of prairie sod. First, you need to find a good patch of prairie. You're looking for ground with thick, tough, tangled grass roots. These roots are the key. They are the reinforcing bars that will hold your dirt bricks together. You take your plow, one of the few crucial tools you were wise enough to bring, and you cut the sod into long, straight strips, about a foot wide and a few inches thick. It's back-breaking work. The prairie soil is dense and hard. Then, you cut these long strips into bricks, usually about 2 or 3 feet long. Each sod brick weighs 50 pounds or more. You lift them, one by one, and begin to stack them, grass side down. You lay them like giant, heavy, dirt bricks, staggering the seams to give the wall strength. You leave gaps for a door and maybe 1 or 2 small windows. The walls rise slowly, a testament to your aching muscles and sheer persistence. The finished walls are 2 or 3 feet thick, providing incredible insulation. For the roof, you have a problem. You still need some wood for the beams. If you're lucky, you can find a little bit of timber down by a creek bed. Or you can pay an exorbitant price for a few precious planks that were hauled in by wagon. You lay these beams across the top of your sod walls. Then you cover them with a layer of brush, more prairie grass, and finally, a thick layer of the same sod you used for the walls. You stand back and look at your creation. It's not a cabin. It's a mound, a squat, earthy structure that looks like it grew out of the ground rather than being built on top of it. From a distance, it almost disappears into the landscape. You have a home, sort of. You move your family and your few possessions inside. The first thing you notice is the darkness, with only 1 or 2 small windows. The interior is gloomy, even in the middle of the day. The second thing you notice is the smell, the earthy, slightly damp scent of the soil that is now your floor, your walls, and your ceiling. Living in a soddy was a unique and often unpleasant experience. These houses were remarkably effective in some ways. As mentioned, the thick walls kept them cool in the brutal summer heat and relatively warm during the savage winters. They were also, for the most part, fireproof, which was a huge advantage in a land of prairie fires. But the disadvantages were numerous and unsettling. Here's a bizarre and creepy detail of sod house living: the dirt. It was never ending. Fine particles of soil would constantly sift down from the ceiling and the walls, dusting your food, your bedding, your clothes. Women would stretch muslin cloth across the ceiling just to catch the worst of the fallout. But it was a losing battle. You were, in a very real sense, living inside a pile of dirt. And you weren't alone. The Saudi was a thriving ecosystem. The walls and roof were full of spiders, centipedes, and mice. Snakes, particularly harmless bull snakes, loved the cool, dark environment and would often be found slithering along the walls or even dropping from the ceiling onto the dinner table. You learned to live with them. As they helped keep the mouse population down, your house was alive, and not always in a good way. Then there was the rain. A gentle rain wasn't so bad, but a heavy, sustained downpour was a disaster. The sod roof would become saturated, and then it would begin to leak. Not just a drip, but a muddy, miserable, all day long rain inside your house. Families would huddle under umbrellas indoors, trying to keep their beds and supplies dry as muddy water dripped on everything. Sometimes, a completely saturated roof could become too heavy and collapse, a catastrophic failure of your earthen shelter. The question of the psychological impact of living in these conditions is something historians and historical psychologists ponder. The term prairie madness was a common one at the time, used to describe the depression, anxiety, and sometimes complete mental breakdowns suffered by settlers, particularly women, who were isolated in these bleak conditions. Was it the unrelenting wind, the vast, empty landscape that offered no sense of scale or shelter, the crushing loneliness, or was it the simple, grinding reality of living in a dark, dirt-filled house, constantly fighting to maintain a sense of cleanliness and order against the encroaching wilderness? The academic consensus is that it was likely a combination of all these factors, a perfect storm of environmental and social stressors. Despite the hardships, you make the Saudi a home. You hang pictures on the dirt walls. You arrange your few pieces of furniture. You scrub the hard-packed earth floor. This strange, living house is your fortress against the vastness of the prairie. It's a testament not to the romantic ideal of the rugged individual, but to the desperate, dirt under the fingernails reality of survival. You didn't tame the wilderness. You took a piece of it, shaped it into a shelter, and hunkered down inside, praying it wouldn't rain. You have a shelter. You're humble, Saudi. You've plowed a small patch of land and planted your first crop. A fragile sense of stability is beginning to take root. You might even think the worst is over. But the greatest killer in the American West isn't a gunslinger, a blizzard, or a grizzly bear. It's invisible. It's silent. And it's already inside you. The real top predator on the frontier is disease. You get your water from the same creek that your small community uses for everything. It's where your livestock drink. It's where you bathe. Occasionally, it's where you wash your clothes. A little further upstream, another family is doing the exact same thing. And a little further downstream, the new arrivals in town have set up their camp. The concept of a sewer system is a distant urban luxury. Human and animal waste inevitably finds its way into your water source. The town itself is a public health nightmare. There are no sanitation departments, no garbage collection. You throw your trash, including food scraps, into a pile behind your house or into the alley. This creates a paradise for flies. Swarms of them are everywhere, buzzing from the garbage heap to the outhouse, and then landing on the food on your table. You wave them away, but it's a futile gesture. You don't know that these flies are tiny messengers of death, carrying typhoid and dysentery on their feet. Then, the first person in your settlement gets sick. It starts with stomach cramps and debilitating diarrhea. This is dysentery, the bloody flux, a common and miserable ailment. But then comes something worse, cholera. The onset of cholera is terrifyingly fast. A person can be perfectly healthy in the morning and be on the verge of death by evening. The disease, caused by the Vibrio cholerae bacterium in contaminated water, leads to catastrophic fluid loss. The victim suffers from extreme diarrhea and vomiting, losing gallons of water in a matter of hours. Their skin turns bluish-gray from dehydration, a symptom that gave cholera its chilling nickname, the Blue Death. Their muscles cramp violently. Their eyes sink into their sockets. They are perfectly lucid but are wasting away before your eyes. There is no effective treatment. You try to get them to drink water, but they can't keep it down. All you can do is watch, helpless, as they shrink and wither. Death often comes within 24 hours. An epidemic sweeping through a small, isolated frontier town is a uniquely horrifying event. There's nowhere to run. The source of the disease, the water, the flies, is everywhere. Fear grips the community. People eye each other with suspicion. They start to shun the families of the sick, leaving food on their doorstep but refusing to go inside. Terrified of catching the illness, the community bonds that were so crucial for survival begin to fracture under the strain of a panic you can't see or fight. Mainstream history acknowledges that disease was a major cause of death, but it's hard to overstate the scale. For every one person killed by a Native American on the Oregon Trail, it's estimated that dozens, perhaps hundreds, died from disease. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery, smallpox, measles, diphtheria. These were the true terrors of the West. Here's a small, grim detail about frontier medicine. The miasma theory. Because you don't understand germ theory, the prevailing scientific belief is that diseases like cholera are caused by miasma, or bad air, a foul-smelling fog or vapor that rises from swamps or decaying organic matter. To combat this, people would do things that seem bizarre to us now. They would burn barrels of tar in the streets, hoping the acrid smoke would purify the air. They would hold handkerchiefs soaked in vinegar or perfume to their noses when they went outside. Some even fired cannons into the air, believing the concussion would disperse the deadly miasma. These actions did nothing to stop the spread of the bacteria in the water, but they were a desperate attempt to impose some kind of order on a chaotic and terrifying situation. The historical debate around this topic often centers on the flow of information. How did people on the frontier learn about epidemics? Without modern communication, news traveled slowly, often by letter or by travelers moving from town to town. Did this slow pace help contain outbreaks, or did it make things worse, as people might unknowingly travel from an infected town into a healthy one? Some historians argue that the isolation of frontier communities could sometimes be a blessing, protecting them from pandemics that ravaged the more connected cities. Others argue that this isolation meant they were completely on their own when an outbreak did occur, with no hope of medical supplies or assistance from the outside world. You watch your community shrink. Every day, there is another funeral, another hastily dug grave on the small hill overlooking the town. You boil your water now, a practice some people swear by, though you don't know why it helps. You've become meticulous, almost paranoid, about cleanliness, scrubbing your hands and your dishes with a ferocity born of fear. You inspect your children for any sign of sickness, your heart leaping into your throat at the slightest complaint of a stomachicae. You survived the trail. You survived the mountains. You built a home with your bare hands. But this is a different kind of survival. It's a battle of attrition against an enemy you can't see. An enemy that hides in a refreshing cup of water or rides on the legs of a common housefly. The romantic dream of the West has been boiled away. leaving a residue of harsh, terrifying reality. Your new life isn't about adventure and conquest. It's about the daily, anxious hope that you and your family will wake up healthy tomorrow. You've dodged disease. For now, your small farm isn't producing enough to live on yet, and your savings have dwindled to almost nothing. You need a job. You need cash. And in the West, that often means working for one of the big, powerful companies that are truly taming the wilderness, the mines, the railroads, or the massive cattle ranches. You hear about work at a nearby silver mine. The pay sounds fantastic. $1 or even $2 a day. It's more money than you've ever dreamed of earning. So you leave your family to manage the sod and the farm plot. And you walk to the mining camp, a sprawling, chaotic twin to the town you first arrived in. You sign up, and that's when you're reintroduced to the beating, exploitative heart of the Western economy, the company store, the mine owner, a wealthy man you'll never meet who lives in San Francisco or New York, is a genius of vertical integration. He doesn't just own the mine. He owns the only store in the camp. He owns the boarding house where you have to rent a bunk. He owns the saloon where you might spend your earnings. And he has a very clever system. You don't get paid in cash. Not in real dollars. You get paid in script. This is a form of private currency, little metal tokens or paper notes. That is only good at the company's establishments. Your $2 a day wage is paid into dollars worth of script. You need to buy a shovel, a pickers, and blasting powder for your work. You buy it from the company store. With script, the prices are, of course, hugely inflated. A shovel that would cost $1 in a competitive market costs $3 in script at the company store. You need to eat. You buy your bacon and beans and flour from the company store. You need a place to sleep. You rent a louse-infested bunk in the company boarding house. At the end of the month, the company tallies up your earnings and subtracts your expenses. Magically, you almost always end up owing them money. Or at best, breaking even. You are working for free. Or worse, you are sinking deeper into debt to the very company that employs you. It's a closed system. A brilliant trap. It's not slavery. Not technically. But it's a form of debt peonage that is incredibly difficult to escape. This system was a cornerstone of the industrial West. The mainstream historical fact is that large corporations, often financed by Eastern and European capital, were the primary drivers of resource extraction. The lone prospector with his mule, panning for gold in a stream, is a romantic image. But the real money was made by organized, industrial-scale operations that required huge investments on the large, disposable workforce. The company store model wasn't just about maximizing profit. It was about control. By keeping you in a state of perpetual debt and dependence, the company ensured a stable labor supply. You couldn't just quit and leave. You owed the store. In some of the more ruthless camps, the company would hire armed guards to make sure debtors didn't try to skip town. Here's a small, insidious detail of the system. The company ledger. Every worker had a page in a large, leather-bound book kept by the store clerk. This was your life's balance sheet. Every purchase, a plug of tobacco, a new pair of boots, a bottle of whiskey, was recorded. The clerk, who worked for the company, had all the power. He could add fees, miscalculate totals, and charge you for things you never bought. You couldn't trade or write. Too bad. You had no way to challenge the numbers. The ledger was the law, and it always favored the house. Many men worked for years, deep underground in terrifying conditions, only to die with their name still on the debit side of the company ledger. The academic debate here is a fascinating one. Some economic historians argue that the company store system, while exploitative, was a necessary evil. In truly remote areas, they argue, it was the only practical way to supply workers. The high prices simply reflected the immense cost of transporting goods to the frontier. They see it as a flawed but functional market response to extreme logistical challenges. Other, more labor-focused historians see it as a deliberate and predatory system of labor control, designed to strip workers of their autonomy and suppress wages. They point to the fact that companies actively fought to prevent independent merchants from setting up shop nearby, sometimes using violence and intimidation to maintain their monopoly. Was it a market necessity or a robber baron's masterstroke? The truth is likely a murky blend of both. So you work. You go to the company store to get your tools. You see the prices, and your heart sinks. You get your first meal at the company mess hall, a greasy, tasteless stew, and the cost is deducted from your future earnings. You go to sleep in your cramped, noisy bunk, and you know the rent for it is ticking up. You haven't even started your first shift in the mine, and you are already poorer than when you arrived. You came west to be your own man, to own your own land, to escape the wage slavery of the East. And now you're standing here, holding a worthless piece of company scrip, more tightly bound to an employer than ever before. The irony is as bitter as the cheap coffee they sell you at an inflated price. The great, open West, the land of freedom and opportunity, has a gatekeeper, and he demands a price you can't afford to pay. The company store was just the gateway to the trap. The trap itself is the mine. The next morning, you join a group of grim-faced men standing at the mouth of a dark hole in the side of the mountain. This is your new office. The shift boss, a man with a face like granite and a voice that sounds like rocks grinding together, hands you a candle. Not a lantern, a candle. This is your only source of light for the next 10 hours. You'll stick it to the rock wall with a lump of wet clay, or hold it in a simple spike holder jammed into a crevice. It's tiny. Flickering flame will have to fight against the darkness, so absolute it feels like a physical substance. You step into the mine shaft, and the sunlight vanishes. The air immediately changes. It's cool and damp, and it smells of wet rock, blasting powder, and stale sweat. You descend into the earth, either down a rickety ladder or crowded onto a crude platform called a cage, lowered by a steam-powered winch. The cage shudders and drops into the blackness, the square of light from the entrance shrinking above you until it's just a tiny star. And then it's gone. You are in the underworld. Your job is brutal and simple. You are part of a two-man team. One man holds a length of drill steel, a long, sharp iron rod. The other swings a 4-pound sledgehammer, striking the end of the steel. After each blow, the first man gives the steel a slight turn. It's a rhythmic, powerful dance of trust. A misplaced hammer swing could mean a shattered hand. You do this for hours, drilling a series of holes into the rock face. The noise is deafening in the confined space, a constant, percussive clang that echoes through the tunnels. Then comes the blasting. You carefully pack the holes with black powder or the new, more powerful but terrifyingly unstable dynamite. You set the fuses, light them, and then you run, scrambling through the dark tunnels to get behind a pillar of rock before the explosion. The blast is a gut punch of concussion and sound that shakes the very mountain. After the dust settles, you go back in, choke on the acrid smoke, and begin the process of mucking out the tons of broken rock with shovels and wheelbarrows. You do this all day, every day, for that company script that's already spent before you've earned it. The dangers are constant and varied. The most obvious is the caving. The mines are a labyrinth of tunnels and shafts, held up by massive timber supports. But these timbers rot in the damp air. Geologic pressure shifts. Sometimes, with a terrifying groan, a section of the tunnel collapses, burying men alive under tons of rock and earth. Every creak of the timber sends a jolt of fear through you. Then there's the air itself. The further you go into the mine, the less oxygen there is. Your candle flame is your early warning system. If it starts to burn low and blue, it means the air is bad. If it goes out, you're in serious trouble. Pockets of poisonous gases like carbon monoxide or methane can accumulate in the tunnels. You won't see them or smell them. You'll just get dizzy, then fall unconscious, and never wake up. Here's a small, morbidly fascinating detail of mine life. The Widowmaker. This was the nickname for a specific type of drilling accident. When you're drilling a hole upwards into the ceiling of a tunnel, you are working directly underneath it. Sometimes, the drill would unexpectedly punch through into a hidden pocket of loose rock or water. The result was an instant, deadly shower of debris and water, giving a man no time to react. It was a constant, terrifying risk of the job. But the most insidious killer in the mines wasn't a sudden accident. It was a slow one. It was the dust. Every hammer blow, every blast, every shovel full of rock filled the air with a fine, sharp dust of silica. You breathe this in, all day, every day. It settles in your lungs, and over the years, it slowly turns them to stone. The condition was called miner's consumption or silicosis. You'd start with a cough, then you'd get short of breath. In the end, you'd be unable to even walk across a room without gasping for air. You would, in effect, suffocate to death over the course of years. It was a guaranteed outcome of a long career in the mines. The company, of course, took no responsibility. A man's cough was his own problem. The academic debate on this topic often revolves around the issue of worker agency. Were these miners simply passive victims of an exploitative system, or did they find ways to resist and assert their own power? The historical evidence shows a complex picture. On one hand, individual miners had very little power, but collectively, they began to organize. The West was the birthplace of some of America's most radical and militant labor unions, like the Western Federation of Miners. They lead massive, often violent strikes for better pay, an 8-hour day, and safer working conditions. These strikes were brutally suppressed by the mine owners, who would hire private armies of strikebreakers and get state militias to intervene on their behalf. The mining West was a battlefield, not just of man against law, but of labor against capital. You finish your 10-hour shift. You are so tired you can barely stand. Your body aches, your ears are ringing, and your lungs are coated with a fine layer of rock dust. You ride the cage back up to the surface, blinking as your eyes readjust to the painful light of the setting sun. You are covered head to toe in a thick layer of grime. You collect your script, go to the company store to buy your meager dinner, and collapse into your book. You lie there, coating, trying to get the dust out of your lungs. You think of your family, of your sod house on the prairie. You came here to earn money to make that dream a reality. But you're beginning to understand the terrible bargain you've made. You're trading your own health, your own future, your own life, for a handful of company tokens. One sledgehammer swing at a time. Perhaps the dark, suffocating confines of the mine aren't for you. You hear of another great enterprise that is hungry for labor, an undertaking that is stitching the country together with iron and steam. The railroad, building the Transcontinental Railroad, its countless offshoots, is the great engineering feat of the age. It seems like noble, nation-building work. And they're hiring. Will pay you. Once again, advertised as excellent. So you trade the darkness of the mine for the wide open spaces of the railroad grade. You quickly learn that this job is just as brutal, and your life just as cheap. You are part of a massive, mobile army of laborers. Your crew might be composed mostly of Irish immigrants, recently freed African Americans, or, especially on the western sections, thousands of workers from China. You live in a temporary, rolling camp that moves every few days as the track progresses. Your home is a filthy, crowded tent or a shoddily constructed bunk car. Sanitation is non-existent. Disease, the same cholera and dysentery from the overland trail, rips through the camps. The work is organized with ruthless, factory-like efficiency. The process is broken down into specialized gangs. First come the surveyors, then the graders. This is your job. You are a grader. Your task is to create a flat, level path, the grade, upon which the track will be laid. This is not gentle landscaping. This is reshaping the earth with primitive tools and sheer muscle power. You work with a pick, a shovel, and a wheelbarrow, all day long, under the blazing prairie sun or in the freezing mountain air. You are digging, hoeing, and dumping. You are cutting through hills and filling in valleys. If a hill is too large to dig through by hand, you bring in the blasting crew, just like in the mines. This involves drilling holes, packing them with black powder or nitroglycerin, and running for cover. The work is incredibly dangerous. Premature explosions were common. Flying rock could kill a man 100 yards away. The railroad companies were obsessed with speed. They were in a race against each other for government subsidies, which were paid out per mile of track laid. This meant safety was a distant, secondary concern. The crew bosses, armed with pistols and fists, push you relentlessly. Work goes on in all weather, in blistering heat waves, in torrential downpour, in the snow. An injury that slowed you down meant you were fired. A serious injury meant you were left behind when the camp moved off. The company took no responsibility. You were a disposable component in a vast machine. The mortality rates were appalling. It's a well-known historical fact that the Central Pacific Railroad, built largely by Chinese labor, had a grim rule of thumb: a dead man for every sleeper. A sleeper, or railroad tie, was laid every couple of feet. While this is likely an exaggeration, the true numbers are still staggering. Thousands of men died from accidents, disease, and exhaustion while building the railroads. Their bodies were often buried in unmarked graves alongside the very tracks they had given their lives to lay. Here's a small, specific detail about the hazards of the job. The food. The logistics of feeding thousands of men in a mobile camp were immense. The diet was monotonous and nutritionally poor, consisting mainly of beef, bread, and coffee. The beef was often of dubious quality. A common and much-hated meal was embalmed beef, a term for canned beef that was treated with chemicals like boric acid or formaldehyde to preserve it. It was tough, tasteless, and likely contributed to the rampant digestive illnesses among the workers. You were literally being pickled from the inside out while you worked. The construction of the railroad through the Sierra Nevada mountains was a particularly hellish chapter. To get through the solid granite, Chinese workers were lowered down cliff faces in wicker baskets, dangling hundreds of feet in the air. They would hand drill holes in the rock, plant their explosive charges, light the fuses, and then frantically signal to be hauled up before the blast. Many were not pulled up in time. During the winter, the snow was so deep, 30 or 40 feet in some places, that they had to dig a network of tunnels under the snow to continue the work, living and laboring in a cold, dark, subterranean world for months on end. The academic debate here often focuses on the Chinese immigrant experience. For a long time, their contribution was largely written out of the triumphant narrative of the Transcontinental Railroad. They were seen as docile, anonymous labor. However, modern historians have worked to uncover their story, revealing a more complex picture. Were they powerless victims? Not entirely. They were paid less than white workers and were subjected to intense racism. But they were also highly organized. They maintained their own social structures within the camps, cooked their own food, and imported their own goods. And they were not afraid to fight for their rights. In 1867, thousands of Chinese railroad workers staged a massive, coordinated strike, demanding equal pay and shorter hours. It was one of the largest labor actions of the era. The company tried to break them by cutting off their food supply, but the workers held out for over a week. While the strike was ultimately unsuccessful in achieving its main goals, it shattered the racist myth of the passive Asian labor. You stand on the finished grade, your back screaming in protest, your hands blistered in drought. In the distance, you can hear the rhythmic clang of the track layers, the end-of-track army, laying the iron rails. You watch the supply train chug up to the new railhead, bringing the materials for the next few miles of progress. It's a marvel of logistics and engineering, but you know the true cost. This great symbol of progress is being built on a foundation of human misery. Every rail is spiked down with the sweat of men like you. Every mile of track is paid for with their broken bodies and forgotten lives. You are building the future, but you have no guarantee you'll live to see it. Whether you're working on the railroad, in a mine, or trying to scratch a living from your own plot of land, your life is governed by your stomach. The grand ambitions of wealth and freedom are often secondary to the daily, pressing question, what's for dinner? The answer, you discover, is nearly always the same, and it is relentlessly, soul-crushingly bland. The diet of the American West was not a feast of rustic campfire cooking. It was a study in calories and preservation. The holy trinity of your pantry is flour, bacon, and coffee. Let's start with the bread. You don't have access to fresh yeast or a proper oven. Your bread is a simple, unleavened affair. You mix flour with water, salt, and maybe a little bit of baking soda or lard if you have it. You then cook this dough in a cast iron skillet over an open fire. The result is a bannock or skillet bread, a dense, heavy, often slightly scorched disk that is tough and chewy. Another variation is the hardtack, a simple flour and water biscuit that was baked until it was, quite literally, as hard as a rock. These were valued not for their taste, but for their incredible shelf life. A piece of hardtack could last for months, or even years, without spoiling. You'd have to soak it in coffee or stew for a long time just to make it chewable. Some soldiers during the Civil War claimed to find hardtack stamped with the date of the Mexican-American War, 20 years earlier. Next is the meat. Your primary source of protein is bacon, not the thin, crispy strips you might picture today, but thick slabs of salt-cured pork belly. It was popular for the same reason as hardtack. It was durable. The high salt content in fat prevented it from spoiling quickly. You'd slice off a chunk and fry it in a pan. The grease from the bacon was a precious commodity. You never threw it away. You'd save it in a can and use it for cooking everything else, from frying your bread to flavoring your beans. This bacon grease was the foundational flavor of the frontier diet. And then there's coffee. Coffee was more than a beverage. It was a necessity. It was fuel. You'd buy green coffee beans, roast them yourself over the fire, a process that was easy to mess up, often resulting in burnt, bitter beans, and then grind them, perhaps by crushing them with the butt of a pistol. You'd then boil the grounds in a pot of water until you had a thick, gritty, incredibly strong brew. It was often called cowboy coffee. You drank it black and bitter. It cut through the morning, cold in the afternoon exhaustion. It was the one small luxury, the one jolt of civilization in an otherwise harsh day. This monotonous diet of bread, bacon, and coffee was the standard fare. If you were lucky, you might have a sack of beans or dried apples. Hunting could supplement your diet. Of course, a rabbit or a prairie chicken was a welcome treat, but hunting was time-consuming and unreliable. You couldn't base your survival on it. This lack of dietary diversity led directly to a host of health problems. The most common was scurvy. You might associate scurvy with sailors on long sea voyages, but it was just as rampant on the landlocked frontier. Without a source of vitamin C, your body begins to break down. The symptoms are horrific. You feel lethargic and weak. Your joints sag. Your gums become swollen and spongy and begin to bleed. Eventually, your teeth loosen and fall out. Old wounds that had healed years ago can mysteriously reopen. It was a dreadful and debilitating disease. This brings us back to a weird and wonderful culinary detail. Pickles. As mentioned on the trail, anything preserved in vinegar was a godsend. A jar of pickled vegetables was not just a tasty relish. It was medicine. Cowboys on long cattle drives would sometimes be paid a bonus if they could find and gather wild onions, which they would eat raw, instinctively knowing they helped ward off the prairie ale, their name for scurvy. The mainstream historical view understands that the frontier diet was limited, but the extent to which it shaped daily life is often underestimated. The constant, low-level malnutrition affected people's energy, their mood, and their ability to fight off other diseases. The academic question here is subtle, relating to culinary history and adaptation. How did different groups adapt their traditional foodways to the limited ingredients of the West? For example, Chinese railroad workers, unable to get their traditional vegetables, became experts at foraging for wild plants that could be used in their cooking. Mexican vaqueros, the original cowboys, brought with them the traditions of cooking with chili peppers and corn, which gradually influenced the broader cowboy cuisine. The history of Western food is a story of improvisation and fusion, of people trying to recreate a taste of home with a very limited palate. Tonight, use it by your fire. The same fire, use it by every night. You are eating the same meal you ate last night. You spear a piece of salty bacon with your knife. You use it to mop up the last of the grease in your tin plate. You chew on a piece of hard, dense bread. You wash it all down with a gulp of gritty, black coffee. It's not satisfying. It's not enjoyable. It is simply fuel. It is the taste of survival. You look up at the vast, starry sky, and you find yourself dreaming, not of gold or land, but of something soft and fresh. A piece of fruit, a green vegetable, a loaf of bread that doesn't fight back. After a long week of back-breaking labor or mind-numbing farm work, you crave a change of scenery, a taste of society. You decide to head into town and visit the most famous institution of the Old West, the saloon. In your mind, conditioned by dime novels and future Hollywood movies, it's a place of high drama. You picture swinging doors, elaborate mirrored back bars, poker games where fortunes are won and lost on a single card, and maybe even a piano player heroically playing through a gunfight. You push through the swinging doors, which, as you now know, are mostly for ventilation and quick ejections. And the reality hits you like a blast of stale air. The first thing you notice is the smell. It's a potent cocktail of cheap whiskey, unwashed bodies, stale tobacco smoke, and sawdust that has been used to soak up a variety of spilled fluids. The room is small, dark, and crowded. It's not the grand, ornate hall of your imagination. It's often just a long, narrow room in a false-fronted wooden building, or sometimes just a large tent. The elaborate back bar is usually just a few rough planks laid across some barrels, holding a motley collection of unlabeled bottles. The floor is dirt or rough sawn wood covered in that smelly sawdust. The clientele is not a romantic assortment of dashing cowboys and mysterious strangers. It's a loud, sweaty, and overwhelmingly male crowd of miners, laborers, and freighters, all looking for a temporary escape from their grim reality. You shoulder your way to the bar. The bartender, or whiskey slinger, is not a wise, philosophical confidant. He's a tired-looking man whose main job is to pour drinks as fast as possible and to break up the fights that inevitably erupt. You ask for a whiskey. He slides a grimy glass in front of you and fills it from a large, unbarreled keg. You take a sip. It's vile. It tastes like fire and paint thinner. This is the famous rot gut whiskey of the frontier. It was rarely the age, mellow bourbon you might imagine. It was often raw, unaged alcohol, shipped west in barrels and then rectified on site. This is a polite term for adulterated. To increase their profits, saloon keepers would stretch the whiskey by adding water, molasses for color, and then a variety of horrifying ingredients to give it a kick. These could include strychnine, chewing tobacco, ammonia, or even gunpowder. This concoction was guaranteed to get him in rum and sick in very short order. It was nicknamed tarantula juice, coffin varnish, or bust head. You drink it because it's what there is, and because its potent effects are the entire point. Here's a small, curious detail about saloon etiquette. The treating ritual. It was a strong custom that when you entered a saloon and joined a group, you were expected to treat, or buy a round of drinks for everyone. Then, each person in the group was expected to reciprocate. This could quickly turn into a long and expensive evening. Refusing to participate in this ritual was seen as a major social faux pas, marking you as stingy or antisocial. It was a system that encouraged heavy drinking and ensured the saloon keeper's profits. The main activities in the saloon are drinking, gambling, and complaining, minced and shoulder to shoulder at the bar, shouting over the noise, swapping stories of work and hardship. In the corner, a poker or faro game is underway. Faro was actually more popular than poker in the 19th century West. It was a fast-paced banking game that was easy to learn, and notorious for being rigged by the house dealers. You watched the game for a bit, seeing men bet their hard-earned scrip or cash on the turn of a coin. Their face is a mixture of hope and desperation. You see more money lost than won. The historical understanding of the saloon is that it was the primary social institution for men on the frontier. It was a bank, a post office, a political meeting hall, and an employment office. It was where you went to hear news, to make business deals, and to feel, for a moment, like part of a community, however rough. The academic debate often revolves around the saloon's role in promoting or curbing violence. The classic Hollywood image is of the saloon as a stage for constant gunfights. The reality is more complicated. Yes, the combination of alcohol, firearms, and men with short tempers did lead to violence. But saloon keepers had a strong business incentive to keep their establishments orderly. A saloon that got a reputation for being too dangerous would lose customers. Most fights were clumsy. Drunken brawls that were quickly broken up by the bartender or other patrons. Guns were sometimes drawn, but they were fired far less often than the myths suggest. Some historians argue the saloon actually functioned as a social safety valve, a place where men could blow off steam in a relatively controlled environment. Others argue that by fueling alcoholism and gambling addictions, saloons were a major contributor to the poverty and social decay that plagued many frontier towns. You finish your glass of tarantula juice, the harsh liquid burning a path down your throat. The noise, the smoke, and the smell are starting to give you a headache. You look at the faces around you, men seeking oblivion in a bottle, hoping to win a fortune from a deck of cards. This isn't the exciting, glamorous heart of the West. It's the lonely, desperate liver. You realize the saloon isn't an escape from your hard life. It's just a grimy, noisy, and expensive reflection of it. You've had enough. You push your way back through the swinging doors, out into the relative peace of the night air, your head swimming and your pocket a little lighter. You've managed to survive the town, the work, and the people. You're back on your own land, your 160-acre kingdom of dirt and hope. You've put your trust in the soil, in the cycle of planting and harvesting. You feel a sense of control here that you can't find in the mine or the saloon. But you are about to learn that you are not the master of this domain. You are merely a tenant, and Mother Nature is a fickle and often cruel landlord. You are out inspecting your first real crop of corn. The stalks are knee-high, a vibrant green against the brown earth. It's a beautiful sight, a tangible result of your sweat and toil. You feel a surge of pride. Then you hear it. A low, distant hum. You look up at the clear blue sky, searching for the source. The hum gets louder, deeper, turning into a strange, crackling roar. And then you see it. The horizon, which was clear moments ago, is now a dark, churning cloud. But it's not a storm cloud. It's moving in a bizarre, undulating way. As it gets closer, you realize with a dawning horror that the cloud is made of millions. No, billions of individual, living things. It's a swarm of locusts. This wasn't just any grasshopper. This was the Rocky Mountain locust, a species that is now, thankfully, extinct. But in your time, it was a biblical plague brought to life. The swarms were incomprehensibly massive. One famous swarm in 1875 was estimated to be 800 miles long and 110 miles wide, larger than the state of California. The cloud descends on your farm. The sky goes dark. The roaring, crackling sound is deafening. They land on everything, on your house, on your clothes, and most horrifilously, on your precious corn. They run into the field, waving their arms, shouting, trying to scare them away. It's like trying to fight a tidal wave with a bucket. They ignore you completely. You watch, helpless, as they devour your crop. They eat the waves, the stalks, everything, right down to the ground. In a matter of minutes, your field of green hope is a barren patch of stubble. They eat the wool off the back of your sheep. They eat the leather harnesses for your plow. They eat the laundry hanging on the line. They eat the paint off the side of your wooden wagon. When they have eaten everything there is to eat, they leave as quickly as they can. The roar fades. The sun reappears. And you are left in a deafening silence, standing in the ruins of your year's work. Your entire food supply for the coming winter gone. This was a common and devastating event on the plains in the 1870s. Entire regions were stripped bare, leaving thousands of settlers destitute and facing starvation. This is the mainstream historical understanding. The environment of the West was an active antagonist. It was just a passive backdrop for human drama. But the locusts were just one of the more spectacular threats. The daily dangers were smaller, quieter, but just as deadly. You're clearing a patch of brush and you reach down to move a rock. You feel a sharp, stabbing pain in your hand. You pull it back and see two small puncture wounds. You have been bitten by a rattlesnake. Panic floods your body. The venom is already beginning to burn. You have minutes to act. The folk remedies are terrifying. Some people will tell you to slice the wound open with a knife and try to suck the venom out. Others will tell you to cauterize it with a red-hot piece of iron. The most common cure, however, was to drink a massive amount of whiskey, on the theory that it would thin your blood or kill the venom. In reality, it just got you dangerously drunk while you were in medical distress. Your chances of survival are not good. The West is teeming with predators. You worry about your livestock, your chickens, and even your children. Coyotes are a constant nuisance. A mountain lion might snatch a calf, but the true king of the wilderness is the grizzly bear. Larger, faster, and far more aggressive than the black bears of the East. A grizzly is a terrifying force of nature. Stories of encounters with them are whispered around the campfire. Tales of trappers and hunters being mauled, of men surviving with horrific scars. You make sure the door to your soddy is barred securely at night. Here's a small, weird detail about the arms race between settlers and nature. Prairie dogging. Prairie dogs, while cute, were seen as a major pest. Their towns of underground burrows could ruin a pasture, and a horse could break its leg by stepping in one of the holes. Settlers waged a constant war against them. A common and rather brutal method was to flood their burrows with water. Another, more inventive method, was to kill a badger, a natural predator of prairie dogs, and leave its carcass near the burrow entrance, hoping the smell would drive the colony away. It was a constant, small-scale war of wits and extermination. The academic debate here focuses on the concept of environmental determinism. To what extent did the harsh environment of the West directly shape the character and culture of the people who lived there? Did the constant struggle against drought, blizzards, pests, and predators create a more resilient, self-reliant, and resourceful type of person? Or did it simply lead to fatalism, brutality, and a view of nature as an enemy to be conquered and destroyed rather than a system to be understood? This debate gets to the heart of the American identity and its complicated relationship with the wilderness. Did the frontier make America? Or did Americans unmake the frontier? You stand in your devoured field. The sun is setting. You have no crop, no food for the winter. You've been beaten, not by a villain or a flaw in your own character, but by the casual, impersonal power of nature. Your dream of being a yeoman farmer, in harmony with the land, seems like a naive joke. You now understand that you are not in a garden. You are in an arena, and you are not the main event. You survived the snakebite, maybe with the nasty scar and the lingering fear of turning over rocks. But now a new problem arises. Your child has a fever. A deep, rattling cough is settled in their chest. It's not cholera, but it's serious. In the city, you would have called for a doctor. Here, in the middle of the prairie, the very idea of professional medical care is a distant luxury. But you're desperate. You hear of a man in the next town over, a man they call Doc. So you hitch up your wagon and make the journey. You find Doc working out of a room in the back of the saloon, or perhaps from a large tent with a sign that says physician-surgeon. The man himself is not what you expected. He may not have a single day of formal medical training. In the 19th century, especially on the frontier. The medical profession was almost completely unregulated. Anyone could call himself a doctor. Your doc might be a former barber, a pharmacist, or just a charismatic salesman with a knack for folk remedies. You bring your sick child into his dusty office. It smells of whiskey and strange herbs. He looks at your child, listens to their chest, and then proclaims his diagnosis with great confidence. He then turns to his cabinet of cures. This is where the real terror begins. The medical knowledge of the era is a frightening blend of ancient tradition, folk wisdom, and outright quackery. The prevailing theory of medicine is still based on the idea of the four humors: blood, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness is thought to be caused by an imbalance of these humors. Therefore, the goal of treatment is to restore the balance, usually through dramatic and invasive means. The doctor's first and favorite tool is very likely bloodletting. He will produce a small, sharp instrument called a lancet and propose to open a vein in your child's arm to let out the bad blood that is causing the fever. This practice, ancient and almost universally applied, did nothing to cure the underlying infection, like pneumonia or bronchitis, and everything to weaken the already sick patient. But it was a visible, dramatic action, which made it seem effective. If not bloodletting, he might try cupping, placing heated glass cups on the child's back to create a vacuum that was supposed to draw out the illness. Or he might apply blistering agents, harsh chemical plasters that would cause large, painful blisters on the skin, which were also thought to release the disease. Then there are the medicines themselves. The doctor will likely mix up a concoction for you. The most common ingredients were powerful, and often poisonous. Calomel, which was mercury chloride, was a favorite. It was a violent purgative, causing extreme diarrhea and vomiting. The theory was that it would cleanse the system. In reality, it was mercury poisoning, causing dehydration, kidney damage, and neurological problems. You would know someone was being treated with calomel by their profuse drooling and a metallic taste in their mouth. Here's a bizarre and horrifying detail about 19th century medicine: the popularity of patent medicines. These were prepackaged remedies sold with extravagant claims. They promised to cure everything from cancer to baldness. Their actual ingredients were a secret, but they were usually a mixture of vegetable extracts and a huge amount of alcohol. Some, like Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, which was marketed to mothers for fussy babies, contained so much morphine and opium that they were little more than narcotics. You might be given a bottle of Kickapoo Indian Sagra, a popular patent medicine that claimed to be an ancient Native American remedy, but was actually just a mix of alcohol and laxatives manufactured in a factory in Connecticut. You were essentially paying to get your sick child drunk and give them diarrhea. The historical truth is that, in many cases, a patient's best chance of survival was to avoid seeing a doctor. A healthy immune system and bed rest were often far more effective than the invasive and poisonous cures of the day. The doctor was more likely to harm you than help you. The academic debate in medical history circles often concerns the mindset of these frontier doctors. Were they cynical charlatans who knew they were peddling snake oil? Or were they true believers in their own methods, sincerely trying to help people with the best knowledge they had? However flawed, the evidence suggests a mix. There were certainly outright frauds, but many practitioners, even the most poorly trained, were likely doing what they genuinely thought was right. They were products of their time, operating within a medical paradigm that was centuries old and on the verge of being completely overturned by the germ theory of disease, a revolution that had not yet reached the prairie. You stand in the dim office, your sick child coughing in your arms. The doc is holding a bottle of dark liquid, promising it will break the fever. You are terrified of the illness, but you are also, on some deep, instinctual level, terrified of the cure. You have no other options. You trade one of your few remaining silver dollars for the bottle of useless, possibly dangerous, potion. You take it home and administer it, praying that your child's constitution is strong enough to survive not only the disease, but the treatment itself. In the Wild West, sometimes the most dangerous man in town was the one with the gun, but the one with the medical bag. The town has grown. More tents, more shacks, more might, and with more people comes more conflict. Disputes over land claims, stolen horses, drunken brawls spilling out of the saloon. The informal justice of a shouting match or a fistfight isn't enough to keep the place from tearing itself apart. The handful of respectable citizens, the shopkeeper, the blacksmith, the man who owns the freight office, decide they need law and order. So they appoint a town marshal, or maybe the county elects a sheriff. You see him for the first time, pinning a cheap tin star to his vest. And he is a profound disappointment. He is not the tall, steely-eyed, impossibly fast gunslinger of legend. He is not Wyatt Earp or Wild Bill Hickok. He is just a guy. He might be the blacksmith, who is strong but slow. He might be a young drifter who was the only one foolish enough to take the job. He is, in short, just a man, probably in over his head. The job of a frontier lawman was not glamorous. It was a poorly paid, incredibly dangerous, and often thankless municipal position. Your town marshal might be paid a meager salary of $50 a month, and he was often paid late, if at all. For this pittance, he was expected to be a one-man police force, judge, and jailer. His main job was not facing down notorious outlaws in the middle of the street. His main job was dealing with the drunks. His daily routine consisted of breaking up fights, disarming belligerent cowboys who wanted to shoot up the town for fun, and hauling unconscious men out of the saloon to sleep it off in the town's pathetic excuse for a jail. The jail was often just a reinforced wooden shack, or sometimes just a heavy chain bolted to a log where prisoners would be secured. He was constantly on duty, walking the muddy streets, trying to be a visible symbol of an authority that barely existed. He was almost always outnumbered and outgunned. Every man in town was armed, and the lawman had, at best, a 6-shooter and maybe a shotgun kept in his office. His real weapon wasn't his firearm. It was his personal courage and the force of his personality. He had to be able to talk a man down, to de-escalate a situation with words, because resorting to violence was a last, desperate, and incredibly risky option. This is the mainstream historical truth that shatters the myth. Being a Western lawman was more about being a long-suffering social worker than a heroic gunfighter. The famous shootouts were exceedingly rare events. For every OK Corral, there were 1,000 nights of dealing with loud, obnoxious drunks. Here's a small, illuminating detail about the economics of law enforcement. The fee system. In addition to his salary, a sheriff or marshal often earned money through fees for performing specific duties. HED get a small fee for serving a warrant, a fee for subpoenaing a witness, and, crucially, a fee for every meal he provided to a prisoner. This created a strange and sometimes corrupting incentive. The more arrests a lawman made, and the longer he kept people in jail, the more money he could make. Some less than scrupulous lawmen were accused of arresting people on flimsy charges just to collect boarding fees for the jail. Your freedom could depend on how much the sheriff needed to make his rent that month. The equipment of a lawman was also far from legendary. While dime novels talked of pearl-handled Colts, your sheriff likely carried a standard, well-used pistol. One interesting and often overlooked piece of his gear was the sap or slapper, a small, flat, leather pouch filled with lead shot. It was a blackjack. It was far more practical for subduing a drunk brawler than a firearm. A quick knock on the head with a sap could end a fight without the paperwork, messy aftermath, and risk of a gunfight. The goal was peacekeeping, not killing. The academic debate on this topic often questions the very nature of law on the frontier. Was the lawman an impartial enforcer of a codified legal system, or was he simply the agent of the most powerful faction in town? In many cattle towns, the marshal was hired by the business owners specifically to control the cowboys, who were seen as a threat to property and commerce. In mining towns, the sheriff was often in the pocket of the mine owners, and his primary role was to suppress labor unions and break strikes. The law was not always blind. It often saw things very clearly from the perspective of those who paid the bills. The line between a lawman and a hired gun could be very thin indeed. You see your town marshal, a tired-looking man in a dusty coat, trying to reason with a young cowboy who is waving a pistol around in the street. The cowboy is drunk, angry, and feeling bold. The marshal isn't reaching for his gun. He is talking. His voice is low and steady. He is trying to calm the boy down, to get him to just go sleep it off. You watch this tense, quiet drama unfold, and you realize the true courage of the West was always in the grand. Violent just. Sometimes, it was in the weary patience of a man trying to hold back chaos with nothing but his own grit and a cheap-tin star. Knowing that one wrong word could be his last. He is not a hero from a storybook. He is something far more real. A man trying to do an impossible job in an impossible place. The tired sheriff manages to talk the young cowboy down. No shots are fired, but the tension that hung in the air was real. Everyone in town owns a gun. You probably own one yourself. A rifle for hunting and a pistol for protection. The idea of the West is inextricably linked with firearms. And eventually, you're going to witness what happens when they get used in anger. It will be nothing like you expect. The classic Hollywood duel is a piece of choreographed art. Two men, noble in their own way, face each other at high noon on a deserted street. They have a deep-seated grievance. They stare each other down. A tumbler rolls by. Then, in a flash of impossible speed, they draw and fire. The hero is faster, his aim truer. The villain clutches his chest, says a few last words, and falls gracefully. Forget all of that. A real gunfight in the Old West was, by all accounts, a clumsy, ugly, and terrifyingly quick affair. It rarely happened in the middle of the street by appointment. It was more likely to erupt suddenly and without warning in the cramped, smoky confines of a saloon, or in a dark alleyway. The participants were not calm, steely-eyed killers. They were usually drunk, angry, or scared, often all three. Their hands would be shaking. Their hearts would be pounding. The famous quick draw was largely a myth, a creation of Wild West shows and early movies. In a real confrontation, the person who won was usually the one who started shooting first, not the one who drew his gun fastest. Surprise and aggression are more important than a fancy holster rig, and the shooting itself was shockingly inaccurate. The handguns of the era, like the Colt Peacemaker or the Smith Wesson Model 3, were powerful and reliable, but they were not precision instruments. They had rudimentary sights and a heavy trigger pull. Hitting a moving target, especially under the extreme stress of a life or death situation, was incredibly difficult. Most of the shots fired in a gunfight, and there were often many, missed their intended target entirely. They would blast holes in the walls, shatter mirrors, and send innocent bystanders diving for cover. You might be enjoying a beer in the saloon when two men at the faro table start arguing. One accuses the other of cheating. Voices are raised. A chair is kicked over. Suddenly, one of them fumbles for the pistol tucked into his belt. He yanks it out and fires. The noise in the enclosed space is deafening. A physical blow to your ears. The room fills with a thick cloud of acrid black powder smoke, obscuring everything. The first shot is followed by another, and then another, fired wildly into the haze. It's chaos. You don't see who is shooting at whom. You just drop to the floor, crawling towards the door, praying a stray bullet doesn't find you. The whole thing is over in seconds. The smoke begins to clear. The silence that follows the roaring guns is even more shocking. Two men are on the floor, bleeding. They are not making defiant speeches. They are groaning in agony. The wounds are ghastly. The large, slow-moving lead bullets of the air didn't just pierce. They smashed bone and tore through tissue, creating massive, devastating injuries. There is no clean, honorable death. There is just the raw, brutal reality of what a piece of fast-moving metal does to a human body. Here's a small, weird detail about the aftermath of a gunfight. Lead poisoning, not for the victim, but for the survivor. If you were wounded in a gunfight and the bullet couldn't be removed, a very common occurrence, you were left with a piece of lead lodged in your body for the rest of your life. Over time, this lead could slowly leach into your system, causing chronic health problems like joint pain, cognitive decline, and kidney failure. You might survive the shootout, only to be slowly poisoned by the evidence of it for decades to come. The mainstream historical view acknowledges the violence of the West, but it's the nature of that violence that is often misunderstood. It was not the stylized violence of chivalrous duels. It was clumsy, desperate, and often pathetic. The academic debate here focuses on the statistics of violence. How violent was the West? Really, some historians, looking at the homicide rates in famous cattle towns like Dodge City or Deadwood, argue that they were, per capita, some of the most violent places in human history. They point to the lethal combination of a young, transient male population, heavy alcohol consumption, and the universal carrying of firearms. Other historians argue this view is exaggerated. They claim that if you remove a few exceptionally violent years and towns from the data, the overall homicide rate in the West was not significantly higher than in some rough neighborhoods in eastern cities. They argue that the idea of the violent West, promoted by dime novels and newspapers, was far more pervasive than the violence itself. The debate continues, with scholars crunching numbers and Dre examining old court records and coroner's reports. You watch as they carry the wounded men out of the saloon. One of them is already dead. The other is unlikely to survive the night, especially if Doc gets a hold of him. There is no glory here. There is no honor. There is just a sticky, spreading pool of blood on the sawdust-covered floor. You look at the pistol on your own head. It feels heavier now. You realize that it is not a symbol of freedom or strength. It is a tool designed for one purpose, to create scenes just like this one. The romance of the gun dies in the smoky, stinking air of the saloon, replaced by the grim, stupid finality of it all. Amidst the chaos of the saloon brawls, the back-breaking labor, and the constant struggle for survival, there's a major part of the Western story that often gets relegated to a supporting role. You've been living it, but perhaps you haven't really seen it. It's the story of the women. In the popular narrative, the women of the Old West are often stereotypes. They are the damsel in distress, the pure school Mariam waiting for the hero to rescue her and build her a white picket fence or they are the saloon girl with a heart of gold. A fallen woman who is both alluring and tragic. These characters existed, of course, but they were a tiny fraction of the female experience. The reality for the vast majority of women on the frontier was a life of relentless, unglamorous, and absolutely essential work. You look at your own wife, or your mother, or the woman on the neighboring claim. Her day started long before yours, and it will end long after, while you are plowing the field or working for a wage. She was running a complex, multifaceted enterprise. The household. This was not just a domestic sphere. It was the central economic engine of the family's survival. Her hands are not soft and delicate. They are stout, callous, and strong. She hauls the water from the creek or the well, a physically demanding task that must be done every single day. She tends the fire, cooks the monotonous meals over an open flame, and bakes the dense bread that forms the core of your diet. She plants and maintains a vegetable garden, which is often the only source of fresh food and the primary defense against scurvy. She milks the family cow, if you're lucky enough to have one, and churns the butter. She raises the chickens and collects the eggs. This produce isn't just for your family's table. She might trade surplus eggs or butter at the local store for coffee or sugar. A small but vital contribution to the family economy. She is also the family's manufacturer. She mends the torn clothes, patching patches until the original fabric is barely visible. She might even spin her own wool and weave her own cloth. She makes her own soap, a smelly, laborious process involving animal fat and lye. She preserves food for the winter, canning vegetables and salting meat. Her labor is what turns your barren claimant your meager supplies into a functioning whole. Without her work, your entire enterprise would collapse within weeks. And then there is the emotional labor. In a world of hardship, isolation, and disappointment, she is often the sole source of comfort and stability. She is the one who tends to the sick children, using her own knowledge of folk remedies when the doc is miles away or untrustworthy. She is the one who educates the children, teaching them to read from a family Bible. She is the one who has to endure the profound loneliness and prairie madness, stuck in a dark sod house for days on end while you are away, with only the howling wind for company. Here's a small, poignant detail that reveals the hidden realities of women's lives. The use of opium. While men had the saloon, women had few socially acceptable outlets for their pain, anxiety, and depression. Laudanum, a tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol, was a common and completely legal substance. It was available from mail-order catalogs and was a key ingredient in many patent medicines marketed to women for female complaints or nervous conditions. For many women, trapped in a life of grueling work and isolation, it was a secret, silent way to cope. Addiction was a common, though rarely acknowledged, tragedy. The mainstream historical view has, in recent decades, begun to recognize the crucial economic contributions of women on the frontier. They were not just passive helpers. They were active partners and producers. The academic debate often centers on the question of whether the West was a place of liberation or of greater hardship for women. One school of thought argues that the frontier offered women new opportunities and a greater degree of equality. The necessity of their labor gave them more power and influence within the family. Western states were also the first to grant women the right to vote, starting with Wyoming in 1860. Some women took advantage of the Homestead Act in their own right, claiming land and running their own farms. Another school of thought argues that while women's labor was more valued, their lives were also significantly harder. They were cut off from the female support networks of their old communities. They faced the constant dangers of childbirth without medical assistance, which had a terrifyingly high mortality rate, and they bore the primary burden of trying to impose civilization, cleanliness, order, culture, on a world that was actively hostile to it. Was the West a step forward or a step back for women's rights and well-being? The answer is not simple, and it varied greatly depending on class, race, and location. You watch your wife at the end of a long day. She is not a damsel. She is not a tragic angel. She is a survivor, a manager, a doctor, a manufacturer, a teacher, a farmer. She is the uncredited co-founder of your new life, the epic story of the West, with its cowboys and its gunslingers, is a story built on a foundation of her silent, unending, and largely invisible labor. The true taming of the West wasn't done with a gun, but with a needle and thread, a garden hoe, and a pair of endlessly working hands. Life on your small claim is a constant struggle. A bad year of drought or a swarm of locusts has left you destitute. You need money, and you need it now. The lure of easy money, the same lure that brought you west in the first place, rears its head again, but this time in a much more dangerous form. You start to hear whispers about the gangs that operate on the fringes, the road agents and outlaws who make their living not by working the land, but by taking from those who do. The Hollywood image of the Western outlaw is one of a charismatic rogue, a Robin Hood figure who is handsome, daring, and adheres to a personal code of honor. He robs from the rich the railroad. The bank end is logged by the common folk. Think of Jesse James or Billy, the Kid as they are often portrayed. The reality, you discover, is much grub beer. Most outlaws were not noble rebels. They were desperate, often psychopathic, men who had failed at every other legitimate enterprise. They were failed prospectors, disgraced lawmen, or just drifters who found it easier to take than to make. Their gangs were not well-organized syndicates, but loose, shifting associations of violent men, held together by greed and mutual distrust. Their primary business was not the dramatic, high-stakes bank robbery. That was a rare and incredibly risky endeavor. The bread and butter of the outlawed raid was much less glamorous, stealing horses and robbing stegecuas. Horse theft was a huge problem on the frontier. A good horse was a man's livelihood. It was his transportation and his work engine. Stealing a man's horse was, in many ways, equivalent to stealing his life. It was considered such a serious crime that it was one of the few offenses for which you were almost guaranteed to be hanged if caught. The outlaws would work in small groups, sweeping through a valley at night, cutting horses from their quarrels, and driving them off to be sold in a distant town where no one would ask questions. Even more common was robbing the stagecoach. You might see the aftermath of one of these attacks. The coach, a sturdy Concorde model, would be stopped in the middle of the road. The passengers, terrified and shaken, would be milling about, their luggage broken open and rifled through. The outlaws weren't after the passengers' personal jewelry. They were after the strung cups. This was a small, iron-bound chest, usually bolted to the floor of the coach, that was used to transport gold dust, payrolls for mines, or other valuable commercial goods. Here's a small, practical detail about stagecoach robbery that the movies get wrong. The classic images of outlaws on horseback chasing the coach at full gallop. This was incredibly dangerous and difficult. The far more common and effective technique was to blockade the road at a narrow pass or a blind corner. They'd defell a tree or roll some rocks across the path. The stagecoach would be forced to a halt, and the outlaws would emerge from the brush with their guns drawn. There was no chase, just a sudden, terrifying ambush. The outlaws themselves were often incompetent. Their planning was poor, and their nerves were frayed. Many robberies went wrong. They might misjudge the timing, or the stagecoach might have an armed guard, the famous shotgun messenger, who put up a fight. The ensuing shootout would be another one of those clumsy, terrifying affairs, often resulting in the deaths of the driver, the guard, or even the passengers. The mainstream historical view recognizes these outlaws as a genuine threat, but it was their unpredictability that was so terrorizing. You weren't worried about a famous gang like the James Younger gang targeting you personally. You were worried about a random encounter with a small, desperate group of local thugs on a lonely stretch of road. The academic debate here delves into the social and economic roots of outlawry. Were these men simply bad seeds, products of poor character, or were they illogical, if violent, product of the West's brutal economic realities? Some historians, particularly those with a Marxist bent, see the outlaws as a form of primitive social rebellion. They were men who had been chewed up and spit out by the capitalist machine, the railroads and the mining companies, and their robberies were a desperate act of defiance against this system. Other historians dismiss this as overly romantic. They argue that most outlaws were simply opportunistic criminals, preying not just on the rich companies, but on their fellow settlers, stealing from the poor and vulnerable just as often as from the powerful. They were not rebels. They were parasites. You are traveling on a freight wagon, or maybe just walking the 50 miles to the next major town for supplies. You come around a bend and see it. The stopped stagecoach, the frightened passengers, the masked man on horseback, hastily strapping the stolen strong cops to a pack mule. They are shouting at each other. Their voice is sharp with adrenaline. One of them sees you. He raises his rifle. For a long, terrifying moment, you are staring down the barrel of a gun. Your life in the hands of a man whose name you'll never know. A man who is just a dirty, desperate part of the West's underbelly. He hesitates, then decides you're not worth the trouble. He and his gang spur their horses and disappear into the hills. You are left with the trembling victims and the wreckage. This is the reality of the Western outlaw. Not a dashing hero, not a cunning mastermind, just a brutal, grubby thief who made the already hard life of the frontier even harder and more dangerous. The outlaws who held you at gunpoint have disappeared into the wilderness. The tired sheriff from the nearest town is days away and has no posse to mount a proper search. The official system of law has failed. And in the vacuum of that failure, a much older, darker, and more frightening form of justice emerges. The Vigilante Committee. A few days later, a group of riders comes through your settlement. They are not lawmen. They are your neighbors. The blacksmith, the store owner, a few of the more prominent ranchers. They are grim-faced, heavily armed, and they ride with a purpose. They are the Vigilance Committee, and they have decided to take the law into their own hands. Vigilantism was a common feature of the American frontier. When people felt that the established legal system was too slow, too corrupt, or simply non-existent, they would form their own parallel system of justice. These committees often had a formal structure, with a constitution, a president, and a set of secret rules. They saw themselves not as a mob, but as an organized, necessary response to chaos. They were, in their own minds, the forces of order. Their methods, however, were terrifyingly direct. They would identify a suspect, someone they believed to be part of the outlaw gang, or perhaps just a local troublemaker with a bad reputation. They would arrest him at gunpoint, often in the middle of the night, dragging him from his bed. They would then hold a trial. This was not a trial with a defense attorney, a jury of peers, and a careful examination of evidence. It was an interrogation, It might last an hour, or it might last 10 minutes. The verdict was often a foregone conclusion, and the sentence was almost always the same: death by hanging. You might witness the result the next morning. You see a small crowd gathered around the only large tree near the town, and you see the body, hanging limp from a thick branch, a rough rope around his neck. A piece of cardboard might be pinned to his chest with a star. Simple message: horse thief or road agent. It is a showing, brutal spectacle. It is a message to all other potential wrongdoers. This is what happens when the community polices itself. This is the well-known historical reality of frontier justice. It was swift, certain, and bypassed all the niceties of the official legal process. And for many people at the time, it was seen as a good thing. Newspapers and prominent citizens often praised the vigilantes for bringing order where there was none. Here's a small, dark detail about the practice of vigilantism: the stranglers. In some areas, particularly in Montana, the vigilante groups became so powerful and feared that they weren't known simply as the stranglers. Their justice was so swift and secretive that people would simply disappear, only to be found days later hanging from a bridge or a tree. The fear of being targeted by the stranglers was a powerful tool for social control, silencing not just criminals, but anyone who dared to speak out against the committee's power. The academic debate surrounding vigilantism is intense and goes to the core of the American idea of law and order. Were these vigilance committees a legitimate expression of popular sovereignty, a form of grassroots democracy in action? This is the argument of the socially constructive school of thought. These historians argue that in the absence of effective state institutions, vigilantes filled a necessary power vacuum, suppressing crime and creating the stability necessary for communities to grow. They see it as a temporary, if brutal, phase in the development of a civilized society. On the other side of the debate are historians who see vigilantism as nothing more than organized murder, a form of domestic terrorism. They argue that these committees were often not about justice, but about power and control. They were frequently formed by the local elite, the wealthy cattlemen, merchants, and mine-owners, to protect their own property and economic interests. They would target not just real outlaws, but also political rivals, labor organizers, or members of minority groups they wanted to drive out of town. The accusation of rustling or theft could be a convenient excuse to eliminate someone who was simply a business competitor or a social undesirable. Under the cloak of justice, they could settle personal scores and enforce a rigid social hierarchy. Was it order, or was it oppression? You look at the body hanging from the tree. You recognize him. He was a drifter who worked odd jobs around town, a man who drank too much and had a reputation for being surly. Was he one of the men who robbed the stagecoach? Maybe. Or maybe he just looked like one of them. Or maybe he just got into an argument with the wrong person, a person who happened to be on the vigilance committee. There is no way to know for sure. There was no trial. There is no appeal. The silence in the town is different now. It's not the silence of peace, but the silence of fear. The outlaws made you feel unsafe. But this feels different. The threat is no longer on the outside. It's on the inside. It's the man you buy your flour from. It's the man who shoes your horse. The law has come to your town, but it's a law without mercy, without due process, and without a blindfold. And you find yourself wondering which you fear more, the chaos of the outlaws, or the cold, absolute order of the vigilantes. You've been so consumed with your own survival, the struggle against the land, the fight for a wage, the fear of outlaws and vigilantes, that you've barely noticed the other people here, the original people, the ones for whom this isn't a new frontier. but an ancestral home. Your presence here, and the presence of thousands like you, is not just a personal struggle, it's an invasion. Your 160-acre claim, granted to you by a distant government in Washington, D.C., was not empty land. It was the hunting ground, the foraging area, or the sacred space of a Native American tribe, be they the Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Apache, or one of hundreds of other distinct nations. Your arrival is a disruption on a cataclysmic scale. Your first encounters are likely tense but peaceful. A small group of Native Americans, perhaps from a nearby camp, might ride up to your sod house. They are curious. They might be willing to trade. They have beautifully tanned buffalo robes or intricate beadwork. You have sugar, coffee, and metal tools, which are valuable to them. You trade nervously. A silent, gestural negotiation across a vast cultural chasm. You see them as exotic, perhaps a little frightening. They see you as, well, you have no idea what they see you as. A strange, tail intruder, an opportunity, a threat. The most profound and immediate conflict is over resources. You see the vast herds of buffalo as a commodity, a source of hides to be sold for cash. Commercial hunting, encouraged by the railroads and the government, is leading to a slaughter on an industrial scale. You might see trains pulling car after car piled high with buffalo hides, or fields littered with carcasses left to rot after being skinned. To you, this is progress, or at least commerce. To the Plains tribes, it is the destruction of their entire way of life. The buffalo is not just a source of food. It is the center of their universe. It provides their food. Their shelter tip is made from hides, their tools from bones, their clothing. The destruction of the buffalo is the destruction of their economy, their culture, and their independence. It's a deliberate strategy of subjugation. And you are, whether you intend to be or not, a part of it. You also bring fences. With your farm comes the concept of private, exclusive land ownership, marked out by barbed wire. This is a completely alien idea to the nomadic and semi-nomadic tribes of the plains. They are used to moving freely across the landscape, following the herds and the seasons. Your barbed wire fence, cutting across a traditional hunting path or blocking access to a vital water source, is an act of aggression. It is a physical manifestation of your claim to own what was once shared. Here's a small, sad detail that illustrates the clash of cultures. The concept of a gift. In many Native American cultures, giving a gift created a reciprocal obligation. It was a way of building social bonds. When Native Americans would enter a settler's home and take a small amount of food, they may have considered it part of this system of mutual obligation. The settlers, viewing it through the lens of private property, saw it as theft. This simple misunderstanding could lead to suspicion, anger, and sometimes violence. An act of social cohesion in one culture was a crime in another. The mainstream historical view of this period is often framed as the Indian Wars, a series of battles between the U.S. Army and various tribes. Battles like the Little Bighorn or Wounded Knee are the famous flashpoints. But the larger story was not one of open warfare. It was a slow, grinding process of displacement and cultural destruction. The academic debate on this topic is vast and complex. But one key area of discussion revolves around the U.S. government's treaty-making policy. The government signed hundreds of treaties with Native American tribes, recognizing their land rights and promising them protection and annuities in exchange for ceding vast territories. Were these treaties legitimate diplomatic agreements, as the government claimed, or were they fraudulent contracts? negotiated under duress and oft undeliberately misinterpreted to the tribes, designed from the start to be broken. Many historians argue for the latter, pointing to the consistent pattern of treaties being made and then violated as soon as the land became valuable to white settlers or corporations. The treaties were not a tool for peace. They were a tool for disposage, cloaked in the language of law. One day, you see it happen. A troop of U.S. cavalry rides through your area. They are escorting along slow-moving column of people. It is the local tribe. They are being forcibly removed from their lands and marched to a reservation, a desolate piece of territory that the government has set aside for them, often hundreds of miles away on land that is unsuitable for farming or hunting. You watch them go. Men, women, and children, their faces a mixture of sorrow and defiance. They are being erased from the landscape that you are now claiming as your own. You don't feel like a conqueror. You feel like a farmer, a survivor. You are just trying to build a life for your family. But you are standing on someone else's land. You are drinking from their water. You are plowing up their ancestral grounds. Your dream is their nightmare. The settling of the West was not the filling of an empty space. It was the violent, tragic, and often deliberate replacement of one world with another. And you, the humble homesteader, are the unwitting, and perhaps unwilling, agent of that change. You have battled against the people, the economic systems, and the very soil of this new land. You feel like you've seen the worst of it. But there is another dimension to the Western environment, one that operates on a scale so vast it makes a swarm of locusts look like a minor inconvenience. It's the weather, and it can unleash a fury that is both impersonal and absolute. You're out in your field one summer afternoon. The air becomes unnaturally still and heavy. The sky, which was a bright, hazy blue, takes on a sickly, greenish-yellow tint. The birds fall silent, and the eerie, oppressive quiet descends. You've learned enough about this land to know that this is not a good sign. You look to the west and you see a monstrous cloud formation building on the horizon. It's a supercell thunderstorm, a churning, rotating behemoth of atmospheric energy. And from the bottom of it, a funnel begins to descend. At first, it's a wispy, tentative finger, but it quickly thickens and darkens as it touches the ground. Miles away, it's a tornado. You've heard stories, but seeing it for yourself is different. It moves across the open prairie with a terrifying, inexorable speed. You hear its voice now, a low rumble that grows into the legendary roar of a freight train. You have only minutes to react. You scream for your family. There is no basement in your sod house. There is no storm shelter. Your only hope is to get away from the house itself, which could be torn apart and thrown on top of you. You grab your children and run to a low-lying ditch or a buffalo wall, a depression in the earth. You lie flat, covering your heads, and pray. The tornado passes close by. The roar is indescribable, a physical presence that vibrates through your bones. The wind is a solid wall, filled with flying debris, dirt, grass, branches, and pieces of your neighbor's farm. The world is a vortex of noise and terror. And then, as quickly as it began, it's over. The roar recedes. A strained, heavy rain, sometimes mixed with hail the size of eggs, begins to fall. You slowly raise your head. Your soddy is damaged, but still standing. It's low, heavy profile having saved it. But your neighbor's wooden barn has vanished. Completely. All that is left is the foundation. This is the casual, terrifying power you are living with. Or perhaps it's not summer, but winter. You think you've seen a blizzard in the mountains. but you haven't seen a true prairie blizzard. It can arrive with shocking speed. A blue norther that drops the temperature 50 degrees in a matter of hours. A clear, sunny day can turn into a whiteout. The snow is not the gentle, fluffy stuff of stories. It's fine, hard, and driven by hurricane force wind. You cannot see your hand in front of your face. You can get lost walking the 50 feet from your house to your lean-to shelter for the animals. Many settlers froze to death just yards from their own doorstep, completely disoriented by the blinding, swirling snow. The mainstream historical narrative of the West acknowledges these weather events, particularly the great blizzards like the school children's blizzard of 1888, where hundreds of children were wrapped in their one-room schoolhouses. But it's the psychological impact of this constant threat that's hard to capture. Here's a small, weird detail about extreme weather on the plains. Straight, Elmo's fire. During intense thunderstorms, a strange electrical phenomenon could occur. The tips of the horns on your cattle would begin to glow with a ghostly blue or green light. The metal parts of your wagon or the tines of your pitchfork might emit a soft, buzzing glow. You would have no scientific explanation for this. It would seem like a supernatural event, a sign from God, or a terrifying omen. It was just another way the landscape felt alien and unmagical in the most unsettling way. The academic debate here often revolves around the climate myth of the West. As mentioned before, the slogan "Rain follows the plow" was a powerful piece of propaganda used by railroads and land speculators. This unscientific theory suggested that the very act of farming, plowing the land, planting trees, would increase rainfall and make the semi-arid Great American Desert a lush garden. The 1870 seconds and early 1880 seconds happened to be an unusually wet period on the plains, which seemed to prove the theory correct. This encouraged a massive wave of settlement into areas that were fundamentally unsuited for the type of agriculture being practiced. Historians debate whether this was a case of genuine scientific misunderstanding or deliberate, cynical fraud. Did the boosters and politicians actually believe their own hype? Or did they knowingly lure hundreds of thousands of families into a climatic trap? The result was the same regardless of intent. When the climate cycle inevitably shifted back to its drier norm in the late 1880 seconds and 1890 seconds, the consequences were catastrophic. Farms failed, and people were forced to abandon their land in droves, their hopes turning to dust. This set the stage for the even greater ecological disaster of the Dust Bowl a generation later. You lie in your ditch as the hailstones pound the ground around you, or you huddle in your soddy, listening to the wind trying to tear your world apart. Piling snowdrifts up to the roof, you realize that your personal struggles are dwarfed by these immense, impersonal forces. You are not fighting an enemy. You are simply living in a place where the rules of nature are written in a language of extreme violence. Your survival depends not on your strength or your cleverness, but on pure, dumb luck, on the random chance of a tornado veering 100 yards to the left instead of the right. The garden of the world can become the apocalypse in a matter of minutes, without warning and without mercy. Years have passed. Your face is lying, your hands are permanently rough, and your body aches in ways you never thought possible. You have survived. You are a veteran of this quiet, brutal war against the land, the weather, and human nature. And then, one day, something strange happens. The war ends. It doesn't end with a bang, but with a series of quiet, inexorable changes. First, the railroad, which you may have helped build, finally reaches your small town. Suddenly, the world is different. The isolation that has defined your life is shattered. A trip that used to take weeks by wagon now takes a day. The train brings new people, but they are a different kind of settler. They are not desperate pioneers in prairie schooners. They are families from the east who step off the passenger car onto a proper wooden platform. They are shopkeepers, bankers, and lawyers, and they are here to build a permanent, civilized town. The train also brings goods. Suddenly, the company store or the single dusty general store has competition. You can buy milled lumber from Michigan, nails from a factory in Pittsburgh, and even canned peaches from California. Your sod house, which was a symbol of your struggle and ingenuity, now starts to feel like a symbol of your poverty. Your neighbors begin to build frame houses, painting them white, with glass windows that shine in the sun. The town starts to look less like a camp and more like the towns you left behind back east. Then, the telegraph poles arrive. A line of slender wooden crosses marching across the prairie, following the railroad tracks. The humming wire strung between them is a direct link to the outside world. News that used to take weeks to arrive now comes in a matter of minutes. The price of wheat in Chicago. Political news from Washington. A declaration of war in Europe. You are no longer on the frontier. You are connected to the nervous system of the nation. With the railroad and the telegraph comes a more organized, less personal form of law. The weary sheriff is replaced by a professional police force. The vigilante committee, once praised as a necessary evil, is now condemned as an embarrassment, a relic of a more barbaric time. A proper courthouse is built, made of brick, with a judge sent by the state. The law is no longer a man. It's an institution. This process is what the famous historian Frederick Jackson Turner called the closing of the frontier. In 1890, the U.S. Census Bureau declared that there was no longer a continuous frontier line in the country. The unsettled areas were now broken up by pockets of settlement. For Turner, this was a moment of profound crisis for the American identity. He argued that the frontier, the experience of expanding into and taming a wilderness, was the single most important factor in shaping American character, fostering democracy, individualism, and ingenuity. With the frontier gone, he wondered, what would happen to the American spirit? Here's a small detail that perfectly encapsulates this transition. The arrival of a mail order catalog. One day, you receive a thick, heavy book from a company in Chicago called Sears, Roebuck & Co. You and your family gather around it in the evening, poring over its pages by lamplight. It is a book of wonders. It contains everything you could possibly imagine. Cream separators, cast iron stoves, fashionable dresses, toys for the children, prefabricated house kits. You can have any of it delivered directly to your new train station. The world of consumer capitalism has arrived at your doorstep. The self-sufficiency you struggled so hard to achieve is now being replaced by the convenience of mass production. The academic debate surrounding Turner's frontier thesis has been raging for over a century. For a long time, it was the dominant interpretation of American history. Today, however, many historians challenge it. They argue that Turner's view was overly romantic and excluded the experiences of women, Native Americans, and various ethnic minorities. They point out that the West was never truly free, and that the story was not just one of heroic individuals, but of conquest and exploitation. Furthermore, they question whether the frontier really closed in 1890. The West, they argue, continued to be a region of migration, conflict, and unique cultural development long after the census declared the party was over. Was the end of the frontier a fundamental turning point in American history? Or was it an arbitrary line drawn by a government clerk? You stand on the porch of your new wooden house. You finally saved up enough to build one. You look out over your fields. The land is fenced with barbed wire. In the distance, you can see the smoke of the daily train. The town has a church steeple now. It's quiet, it's orderly, it's safe, and a strange sense of melancholy settles over you. The wildness is gone. The terrible, beautiful, deadly freedom of the early days has been tamed, fenced in, and scheduled. The constant, life or death struggle that defined you for so long has been replaced by the quieter, more mundane struggles of mortgages and crop prices. You have won. You have survived the Wild West, and in doing so, you have helped to destroy it. The very success of the pioneers meant the end of the frontier. The world you nearly died to create is a world in which you, the rugged pioneer, are now obsolete. You are old now. You sit in a rocking chair, not the one you left on the trail, but a new one, bought from that Sears catalog, on the porch of your wooden farmhouse. The world you inhabit is a place of quiet routine. The mail arrives on time. The church bell rings on Sunday. The seasons turn, and you plant and you harvest. But the desperate edge is gone. The threat of starvation has been replaced by the worry of market prices. The fear of a tornado is still there, but now you have a proper storm cellar. You look at your hands. They are gnarled and scarred, a roadmap of a life of hard labor. Each scar tells a story. This one, from a slip of the axe while building the first fence. This one, a burn from a sputtering campfire on the trail. This one, a faint white line where the rattlesnake bit you. They are the artifacts of a life that feels like it belonged to someone else. In another world, your children are grown. They don't understand that world. They were born in the frame house, not the sortie. They went to a proper school. Their hands are smooth. They talk of moving to the city, of becoming clerks or engineers. They look at you with a mixture of respect and pity, as a relic from a bygone era. They have heard your stories, but to them, they are just stories, as distant and unreal as the dime novels they read. They can't feel the grit of the trail dust in their teeth or the soul-crushing cold of a mountain blizzard. The mainstream historical understanding of this final phase is one of reflection and myth-making. The generation of survivors, like you, began to tell their stories. Old settlers' picnics became a common event, where veterans of the trail would gather to reminisce. Their memories, softened by time, often focused on the adventure and the camaraderie, editing out the worst of the filth, the fear, and the misery. This is the raw material from which the romantic myth of the West would be built. You look out at your land, the 160 acres you bled for. It's a successful farm. The soil is rich. The corn is tall. But what was the cost? You think of the people who are not here. The child from the wagon train who was taken by cholera. The young miner buried in a cave-in. The man who hung from the vigilante's tree. The Native American families who were driven from this very spot. Their ghosts are part of the soil now. Their absence is the invisible price of your success. Here's a final, small, and poignant detail of a survivor's life. The phantom pains. Long after you've recovered from the physical hardships, the psychological scars remain. You might wake up in the middle of the night in your comfortable bed, your heart pounding, convinced you can hear the roar of a prairie fire. You might feel a sudden, irrational pang of thirst on a cool day, a memory of the desperate water searches on the trail. You might flinch at the sound of a slamming door, your mind momentarily transported back to the chaos of a saloon brawl. You survived the West, but in some ways, it never really leaves you. The final academic debate we'll touch on is the one over the very meaning of survival in this context. What did it mean to succeed on the frontier? Was it purely economic, ending up with a profitable farm or business? Was it social, becoming a respected member of the new community? Or was it something more personal and psychological? Some historians argue that for many, true success was simply the act of enduring, of holding on to one's family and one's sanity in the face of overwhelming odds. They suggest that the greatest legacy of the pioneers was not the towns they built or the fields they plowed, but the simple, profound act of not giving up. You think back to that first day, when you saw that colorful poster advertising the garden of the world. You think of the young, naive person you were, full of a desperate hope. Was it worth it? You look at your grandchildren playing in the yard, their laughter carrying on the evening air. They will have lives you could never have dreamed of. Lives with doctors, with schools, with safety. You sacrificed your youth, your health, and a piece of your soul to give them this quiet, orderly world. You were promised a garden and found a battlefield. You fought, you bled, you endured, and you scraped the life out of the unforgiving dirt. You didn't become a hero. You didn't find a fortune. You became a survivor. And as the sun sets over the peaceful fields that were once a wild and terrible frontier, you realize, with a deep and weary sigh, that maybe that was more than enough. The journey is over now. The dust is settled, and the sounds of the prairie have faded into a gentle hum. You can feel the weight of that history, the immense effort of all those lives. But it's a distant weight now, like a story that has been fully told. The struggles of the trail, the fear in the darkness of the mine, the biting cold of the blizzard, they are all just echoes. You are safe now, far from that world of hardship. You are here, in the quiet of your own room, warm and secure. Let the silence of those vast, empty plains become a peaceful quiet in your mind. Let the gentle rocking of the wagon lull you into a state of deep rest. The long, hard day is done. The survivors have found their peace, and it is time for you to find yours. There is nothing left to do now but to let go, to drift into the soft, welcoming darkness, and to sleep.